Hey everyone, thanks for being here this morning. So just moved away from my slides. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining our Delta Science Plan workshop this morning. I'm going to provide a few quick reminders, or maybe your first ever notice. If you have not been in a meeting in this building before, in the event of an emergency requiring building evacuation, everyone will be asked to remain calm, take all your belongings, and proceed to the nearest exit out of the building. The safety relocation point in an evacuation is 1615 9th Street, which is a park. You don't have to remember that. We'll all be going in the same direction. Please look for building staff holding the second floor sign, which will be me. All are encouraged to assemble at the relocation point with the other building employees. If you need the restrooms, they're at the top of the stairs outside the door. And there is free Wi-Fi. It's just called CNRI guest, and you should not need a password. We also want to offer a reminder that by participating in this workshop, you consent to be recorded and your likeness or thoughts may be captured or used in Delta Stewardship Council materials. You may notice that we have someone in the room taking photos, and we just want to give you all a heads up. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Lisamarie Windham-Myers, our Delta lead scientist, to get us started this morning.
Okay, thank you, Tricia. Thank you all for being here in Sacramento. Good morning, and good morning to people online. You see the numbers sort of picking up, so I think people are getting their coffee and getting situated. I'm Lisamarie Windham-Myers. I'm the Delta lead scientist, and I want to welcome everyone to this Delta Science Plan workshop. This is the first of 2 days of information sharing and brainstorming together to support the development of the 2025 Delta Science Plan. And I also want to take this moment to thank California Sea Grant. Anybody in the room? I can point a note for providing us with refreshments for our in-person part of the workshop. So I'm just going to take a chance to say thank you, Sea Grant. All right, so jumping into today's content, I want to orient us to the talks and discussions. The Delta Science Plan is a 5-year document for the Delta Science community. It's called for to be developed through an open, transparent, and inclusive process. It is not just a Delta Science program product for the Delta Science program, but it's informed by and for improving, for the whole Delta Science community, for the purpose of improving how we do science in the system. The Delta Science Plan shares vision, principles, and approaches to better coordinate science and more effectively communicate the outcomes of science activities. The Delta Science program is currently working to develop the 3rd iteration of the Delta Science Plan, which is why we are here today. So I also want to provide a brief overview of the Science Action Agenda and the Delta Science Plan. The Science Action Agenda, or SAA, and the Delta Science Plan, DSP, are 2 of the 3 components of the overall Delta Science strategy, the 3rd being reporting in the lower left corner, such as through syntheses products that we've published, such as the State of Bay Delta Science. The SAA is the science agenda for the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, and it's updated roughly every 5 years, and it's used to guide funding calls by the DSP and other funding entities. While the SAA focuses on prioritizing and addressing management needs and critical science gaps, the Delta Science Plan provides a roadmap, and it's for doing science in the Delta in a collaborative way. The 2019 Delta Science Plan includes 26 actions to address 6 collaboratively developed objectives. For the next iteration, we're considering ways to make the Delta Science Plan even more effective, relevant, and responsive to emerging challenges. So the Delta Science Plan can be a mechanism to drive innovative change in the way we do science. Many tasks are performed by the Delta Science program, but many are partnerships with other organizations. So this effort is something that you and your organization might be identifying nexuses for ongoing work that you are doing already and into the future. So some examples from the 2019 Delta Science Plan include the Social Science Task Force effort, completed in 2020, which was established to integrate social sciences into Delta resource management. This resulted in many actions, including the hiring of a social science extension specialist for the Delta and the release of the first ever Delta resident survey in 2023. that provided meaningful insight into Delta residents' beliefs and perceptions in the Delta. The first annual crosscut budget is another highlight. It was led by the Delta Science Program and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. It was released in 2020, and it details how annual funding from across the science enterprise is utilized, and it reveals gaps and opportunities for improvement. Independent peer reviews were conducted between the Delta Science Program and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Water Resources, and the Central Valley Regional Water Board, just to call out a few. The capacity for synthesis was expanded through engaging with the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and also that was done with many other organizations. The Delta Science Program also released the Delta Science Tracker in 2023, which is a web-based tracking system of science activities in the Delta. And the Modeling Collaboratory is actively being developed now to align modeling needs among disparate groups. And these are just some of our outcomes, but if you have others you want to celebrate, please share them during today's meeting. For the first Delta Science Plan was developed in 2013 at the direction of the Delta Plan and supports the Delta Reform Act requirement that we use the best available unbiased science in policy and decision making. The 2013 Science Plan included direction to update in 5 years. And the second Science Plan was released in 2019, and now we are working to release the third later this year. During the review of the 2019 Delta Science Plan, the Independent Science Board provided a memo asking the Science Plan to be bolder, more flexible, and more strategic. So we took that to heart as we scoped the development of the 2025 Science Plan. In previous iterations, we had structured the Delta Science Plan around major advances for the Delta science community, things like adaptive management and modernizing the Delta science infrastructure. As we reviewed the implementation of the 2019 Science Plan to prepare for the 2025 update, we also conducted a literature review and identified grand challenges from visionary documents in the Delta. So for this iteration of the Delta Science Plan, our former lead scientist, Dr. Laurel Larson, who you'll hear from later, and former Deputy Executive Officer of Science, Dr. Louise Conrad, who I also believe will be here, had the vision of updating the Delta Science Plan to be oriented towards addressing grand challenges to Delta science in order to respond to the Independent Science Board's previous call for a bolder approach. So therefore, we are crafting this 2025 Delta Science Plan to strategize methods to address these grand challenges. So let's just go over how, again, we crafted these challenges. You may remember this graphic. We reviewed Delta-specific visionary literature, specifically 32 documents going back to about 2007. We identified 125 candidate grand challenges. We then worked as a team to review the grand challenges against criteria defined by the National Research Council, which is ultimately about being compelling questions and challenges and feasible challenges to address. This resulted in 17 challenges, which were then further refined into 4 challenges. And those final grand challenges were compiled into an essay that was released in November 2024. There's a copy at the back of the room, and it's also online for the folks to take a look at if they don't have a copy. And it was released after a public comment period. The grand challenges were also highlighted at the State of the Estuary Conference and at the Bay Delta Science Conference in 2024. So just a show of hands, how many people in the room here were at either conference, State of the Estuary or Bay Delta Science Conference this year? Oh, great, it was the majority. Anybody at the town hall, Jeopardy, Delta Science Plan Division? Okay, all right, then for $200. What was George Washington's favorite fish? Henry gets a baseball cap. Thank you very much, Henry. All right. So let's go through the challenges as we have compiled them. They're explained in much greater detail in the essay, but they can be synthesized into these bullets. These grand challenges are numbered, but do not depict a hierarchy. In fact, we're going to start with 3 and 4 today, and then get to 1 and 2 tomorrow. These are: scientists and managers must anticipate a world in which environmental conditions and regulations may be fundamentally different than those faced today. Environmental change is outpacing the traditional pace of science. Flows of scientific information remain decentralized and poorly connected to communities and decision makers. And other ways of knowing, including traditional knowledge, remain siloed from decision making. So these will be structuring our discussions today and tomorrow. And again, they're in the documents I've provided to you if you want to revisit them and more of their background. Before we shift gears into talking about today's agenda, I want to briefly highlight some areas of growth that have occurred since the last science plan and that are well captured in the grand challenges. And that's specifically expanding opportunities for community-based and participatory research and interweaving traditional knowledge. Since 2019, we've made significant progress in recognizing the importance of these areas of work, and we want them to be emphasized in the 2025 science plan. Those of you in the Grand Challenge 3 and 4 work groups today will have a chance to share more, but some recent examples of successes here include the rehiring of a California Sea Grant Extension Specialist for social science and the expansion of the Delta Independent Science Board's vacancies. There's 3 upcoming to include holders of traditional knowledge. So with this in mind, we'll focus now on today's agenda. All right. So again, we're here today because we wanted to come to you, the Delta Science community, to hear about the areas where this update to the Delta Science Plan can help you do your work. And that is why we supported this workshop, to hear from you. First up this morning, we're going to hear from Dr. Sam Luoma, the editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Journal and emeritus USGS scientist. Given that these grand challenges are not hierarchical, we're going to start with grand challenges 3 and 4, and with 1 and 2, we'll discuss those tomorrow. Grand challenge number 4 will be discussed in a panel facilitated by Dr. Xoco Shinbrot in the back of the room. Want to raise your hand, Xoco? Wonderful. She's from the Delta Science program. And then we will have a break for lunch. People who are in person, we have lunch available outside for you, outside the doors, again, provided by California Sea Grant. We're grateful for that. When we return from lunch at 1:30 this afternoon, we'll have the council chair, Julie Lee, bring us back together. And then we will have Dr. Mark Lubell from UC Davis join us to speak about grand challenge number 3. Then the real work begins. And that's when we'll be working together to discuss with a structured conversations to focus on priorities for the Delta Science community to tackle and work toward addressing the grand challenges in the next 5 years. We'll be breaking out into small groups to discuss grand challenges 3 and 4. We will take our afternoon break before going through to report out. And then finally, we'll have a closeout of the science today by the science program's Deputy Executive Officer, Henry DeBay, who's also in the room. Raise your hand. Thank you, Henry. Great. All right, and so before we move on to our next speaker, any procedural questions? Okay, I think we can move forward. I'd like to introduce our opening speaker, which is Dr. Sam Luoma. Dr. Luoma spent over 34 years as a project chief at the U.S. Geological Survey and was the first lead scientist for the Cal-Fed Bay Delta Science Program, which is the predecessor of the current Delta Science Program. He is still very scientifically active, and he's currently the editor-in-chief, as you know, for the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal. And we're grateful for his attendance today, as Dr. Luoma brings us a wealth of knowledge on successes and shortcomings in planning for science from his remarkable career. I also want to say that Sam was the first person I met at USGS in Menlo Park, and is the reason I left academics to come to the USGS in 2004. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Sam Luoma.
Thank you, Lisamarie, for the wonderful discussion. Can you hear me okay over here? Thanks for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to kick off the workshop here. It's a real honor and privilege, again, to talk to this group. One mission of the science program and the science community in general is to help us think about the future and the long horizon, and the vision of the grand challenges are a successful illustration of that. But for the challenges to be taken as seriously as they deserve, We need to link the tools that address them, the context of the present and the past. That's what I'm going to try to do to get this workshop started. A part of that context is those who declare the past management of California water and ecosystems a failure, presumably including our science enterprise. And a sentiment among some that fast-moving disruption of existing institutions is necessary to address the future. From my experience, I prefer a view that realistically looks at what we have accomplished in the past rather than focusing on what we have not. Firstly, I think if we spend too little time identifying what we have accomplished, those accomplishments get taken for granted. They become vulnerable to declarations of failure and even erased in the name of disruption, if we don't detail them somewhere and if we don't establish them in what we call our conventional knowledge. Secondly, the grand challenges remind us that we must accelerate our abilities to adapt, become more nimble, become more flexible. This requires an institutional and intellectual base from which to build. And we've got part of that base built. But starting over isn't an option. In our experience, when we start over, we end up back where we were and we just lose time. In fact, we have in place many elements in the necessary base. It, of course, can be refined and integrated, but that's my main message today. Let's not take that for granted. Let's think about what we have accomplished, and that's what I'm going to try to do. So I hope this look back is a useful way to help us look forward and think about how we take advantage of this exciting new developments that we're going to hear about in the talks that follow. So one of the important things we've learned is about the context. Oh. Sorry, maybe I'm doing this wrong. Yeah. There we go.
Just use that.
Okay, great. Thanks. So one of the things that we have learned over time is that we know the problem with which we're presented quite well. And it's a big challenge, what we called in a 2015 paper, a devilishly wicked problem. We have a large population with a thriving economy in a water scarce environment, a highly variable water scarce environment. Complicated, highly disturbed estuary and delta ecosystems with deteriorating ecosystem services, ever-shifting crises, floods, droughts, changing mandates that are really difficult in terms of the way they consume the capacities of our ability to manage. Politically, we have multiple factions competing for water, high stakes, conflict is common, as Tim Quinn in a brilliant 2024 description of the paper describes warrior coalitions at times, other times we form collaborative coalitions. As Mark LaBelle will talk about in the talk that follows, our management system is a web of interactions, polycentric in nature. And we also have a lot of scientific uncertainty, things yet to learn around our complicated hydrology and insufficiently understood ecosystems, and the challenges remind us that addressing these problems is urgent. Those are things we've learned over time, things we all know. We also have a historical context, I mean. And one of the lessons one of the characteristics here is an increasing pace of change. From the 1850s to the 1920s, we went through 70 years of what's called delta reclamation. 25 to 65, 40 years of water projects ending in the failure of the peripheral canal. That's 110 years of development. We can't expect to recover from that in a decade or two. The early 1970s, well, the late 60s actually, the Santa Barbara oil spill, the 1970 oil spill in San Francisco Bay kicked off an environmental movement with the first Earth Day in 1970, a period of 35 years of what historians call environmental awakening. 1976 and 77 are still two of the driest years on record, a drought that kind of shook up Californians. 1987 to 1994 was a prolonged drought. reminding us of the water scarce environment we live in. During that time, we started to regulate distribution of water because we had to. The Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act resulted in things like the listing of Delta smelt. Anadromous fish restoration was promised by 2002. Here we are a little bit later. CVPIA was founded in 1992, and this was the first designation of environmental water, 800,000 acre feet for the environment. These changes resulted in an intensification of something that's gone on for a long time in California, wars over water. In 1994, the Department of Interior under Bruce Babbitt, led by Betsy Reekie here regionally, developed or put together a water accord in which all sides realized that war wasn't profitable. It was time to try to work together on solving these problems. And in 1999, that resulted in a record of decision that created the Cal-Fed Bay Delta program. The last 25 years is the time that we're most familiar with. I could have called this both a time of finding our way forward on one hand, and a remarkable progress on the other hand, toward more increasingly effective management built on the back of science. The Cal-Fed experiment between 1999 and I guess 2007 was something some people don't even want to talk about because it was such a spectacular failure in the end when it collapsed. But in fact, it was really pretty interesting. It was an attempt to develop what we call now the water czar concept. At least that's my view of it. In other words, an external force was in charge of managing water, but in this case, it was a collaborative force. There was a committee of stakeholders that oversaw decision-making. The day-to-day operations of managing water were run by the departments in the agencies, federal and state agencies on the one hand, but on the other hand, over the top of this was this large collaborative that included that managed everything or the future of everything from water movement to conservation to a science program. This is when the science program was initiated in 1999 as a part of the record of decision. The Cal-Fed was also built on promises that couldn't be kept. And as a result, its collapse it's pretty spectacular collapse in 2007. This is followed by what we might call the BDCP water fix era. Some really remarkable cooperation occurred during that time, in which new biological opinions were developed. The Delta Stewardship Council was created. The co-equal goals were established by the legislature, the co-equal goals being to restore ecosystems and at the same time take care of water supply reliability. The Delta Plan was initiated and it was first written and eventually approved during that period. At the same time, it was a time of really intense litigation and what we call combat science. In other words, arguing about who's right instead of thinking about what we don't know and how we move forward. Court decisions at that time went back and forth, benefiting one faction and then another. And ultimately, in 2013, there were 10 lawsuits in 1 year that were filed, and the courts got tired of the whole thing and said, well, you people get together and try to figure this out. I call that a period perhaps when collaboration started to be regrown. The Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program, a committee of stakeholders, again, that was put together to try to talk about uncertainties in the science behind the regulations we're arguing about, was put together and has been and held together for about 11 years. During that period, I think the biggest benefit of CSAMP was the building of trust. In 2019, the new administration adjusted the rules again, and I think trust started to erode again. Here we are in 2024, and we're at another turning point. As Lisamarie mentioned, we have a new generation of management rules, perhaps new structures in the offering, and CSAMP was suspended this year, the collaborative, and there are some worries about a refracturing of cooperation back and forth over this period. One of the lessons, we can't necessarily expect linear progress, even if we're making progress. I think it's evident through this time of litigation conflict versus cooperation and collaboration. So what's next? More important, what lessons have we learned from this? What have we accomplished over this period of time? First of all, the half-empty side of the glass, what slowed us down? First of all, I think CalFed fell apart. Historians say CalFed fell apart because of unfulfilled promises. The standoff amongst different factions was broken by promising something for everyone. The federal government promised water would be available to satisfy everyone's wants. And of course, I think we've fast learned that was not something that we can really do. I think the demise of CalFed fundamentally was a function of underestimating the realities of our environmental context, the challenging context, the wicked problem that I described earlier. The other thing we learned is that conflict in this system is probably unavoidable. Too high a stakes, too little water. Erosion of trust among factions can result in water wars and water science, and if that's all we do, we actually don't make progress. So management of conflict is really important. Management of water has to occur at the edges of the state of knowledge, and that's what we do. And we have to do it that way. But interpretations can differ there, and that's where conflict arises. And again, sometimes that's necessary. But combat science, arguing about who is right, is not enough to sustainably resolve conflicts. We have to think about what we don't know, what's caused, what underlies the conflicts, and what we do next. This is an ongoing process of incrementally growing. We also have had a little bit of trouble figuring out the proper balance between learning and doing. Those of us who have sat in a lot of these discussions have heard the worry about paralysis by analysis at one extreme. At the other extreme, I've seen way too many examples of artificial deadlines, frenetic activity resulting in stranded investments and activities for which we have not documented the value and as a result are difficult to sustain. And finally, the other challenge we have faced is difficulties in fully implementing adaptive management. Lack of trust, fear of failure, and insufficient collaboration lie behind this. Perhaps more positive is to think about the lessons that we've learned. The positive lessons that we've learned. As we went through this history, there's been an evolution of the culture about learning, which is a really important basis, has to be a really important basis for accelerating adaptation. In the beginning, the water projects here of course, our advanced engineering, involve advanced engineering and hydrology, and that's primarily what we were focused on. The Interagency Ecological Program itself, a remarkable achievement in collaboration, started monitoring ecosystems in 1950, but that monitoring grew over time, and today we have one of the most comprehensive sets of data, comprehensive in time and space and in the quality of the science of anywhere in the world when you talk to people who look across estuaries like San Francisco Bay Delta. We also began to grow the natural sciences during this period. Randy Brown, who was with the Department of Water Resources, had the ear of one of the most powerful people in the state, the head of the Department of Water Resources. He convinced him to start hiring natural scientists, that we needed to look at the ecosystem at the same time as we were working on the engineering of the water culture. I think there are probably great-grandchildren, grandchildren, and children of Randy, at least professionally, in this room today or online. 1994 to 1999, the Water Accord taught us that we can adapt to change. The drought taught us that change is necessary. And again, Betsy Reekie and Bruce Babbitt's attempt broke some of the early barriers of people who frankly did not like each other and did not want to talk to each other, ultimately came together in one group. They taught us that managing conflict is possible and some of the ways to do it. CalFed itself, again, a spectacular failure, maybe administratively, maybe as a disruptive effort to manage in a different way, changed the science culture. It changed the culture of learning permanently. The tools that, some of the things that Lisamarie listed in her slide we tend to take for granted. Those tools didn't exist before 1999. Those tools were conceived during this period and they have grown since then. Accelerating adaptation requires accelerated learning. And the institutional pieces to do that, and again, Lisamarie listed many examples, exist today. I'm suggesting let's just not take them for granted. The Delta Science program itself provides an umbrella over the science we do here. But we also have multiple places where multiple science venues, watersheds, stakeholders, agencies, universities, all have science programs focused on the Bay and Delta and how we do this better. When this first became evident, I thought perhaps this was, maybe it was redundant. But in fact, I think when you look back on it, this is essentially a diversification in our investment. This is a guarantee on the way to move forward. A diversification of the directions of learning has really helped us grow and mature a system that can be effective in growing learning. Agency, university, stakeholder cooperation and collaboration didn't exist before 1999. Everybody was in their own silo, including people working in the Bay, siloed from those very few people working in the Delta. Competitive grant solicitations, internships, independent science board, independent expert panels, National Academy reviews, those are all part of our culture today. Those grew in the last 20 to 25 years. Those are accomplishments, not something we should take for granted. We have ways of communication, and we do communicate amongst each other. The science conference, what a great example. Look at the authorship on the papers in the science conference. Examples of collaboration across the board that didn't exist before. We have San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science, where free for readers and free for authors, an unusual example of diamond level open access publication. Doesn't exist anywhere else. A great example, thanks to the support by the Delta Stewardship Council. We could certainly do better in terms of management stakeholder collaborations, and we can certainly do better in terms of links in science and policy. But we continue to work on these. I'm not saying that everything is great. I'm just saying let's not take for granted what's been built here over the last 20 to 25 years and not pretend that it's of value and that we need to throw it all away. We also know how to manage science. Monitoring, synthesis and assessment of data, understanding the processes that drive change, and ad hoc review and advice from experts around critical issues. Those have to grow together if you're going to grow a science program. Let's also, however, think about what we have accomplished with regard to each of these. The skeptics would say, well, you grew all this learning. What have we got from it? You haven't recovered the species. I've heard that over and over in some of the more contentious conversations that I've sat in. But let's think just a little bit. Think about your own area of expertise. Just take a few minutes and go back and search and see what literature was there before we began this collaborative effort in 2000. You won't find very much. We knew very little about the Delta during the 1990s. The Interagency Ecological Program was working during this time, but the thing that's changed with the IEP is now the public knows about Delta smelt. The public knows about the salmon issues. The science community knows the findings are published, the trajectories are clear. So and that was one of the big criticisms of IEP that at least the advisory groups that looked at it in the 80s had, is that there wasn't enough publication, there wasn't enough external communication of the results, but that has changed tremendously. Our syntheses and assessment have been remarkable in helping us grow. Things like the pelagic organism decline analysis, the float studies that helped us understand the importance of temperature for Delta smelt, understanding of water column processes, understanding of wetlands. You go back and look at the early issues of San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science. You can see some of the early reviews on this. We knew nothing about Delta smelt, but in 2005, Bill Bennett's 2005 paper that kind of synthesized what we had learned to date kicked off a tremendous learning about these native fishes and what affects their well-being. We've reversed the trajectory of wetland decline. We may not have recovered species, but we've done that. When I was hired as the lead scientist in 1999, I was told we do not spend money on climate because we can't engineer it. And in those days, it was called global warming, but we had to change that name because it was too political. Well, we kind of ignored that. And both our investments here and investments across the world have resulted in an understanding of what's happening in a way that it's become a major part of how we manage water in California. And as we improve things like weather forecasting, it's going to become even more important in helping us adjust to the future. Things like the Sacramento and Stockton cleanup of the sewage treatment facilities have reduced certain kinds of nutrient input in the bay. We can go on and list these positive things. We haven't recovered species, but we haven't asked the question, what would it be like? What would this place be like if we had not had the learning that we've had, the regulations that we've had, and the things that have moved forward? I think it would be really different. The Chesapeake and the Baltic studies have been made using the models they have of what nutrient release into those systems would have resulted in if we had not had the regulations they had, and they found out things would be much worse now. And I think if we did the same studies, we'd find the same. Sorry. The other thing we've learned about is managing conflict and building trust. We could do a better job now of building on the precedent that was established in the past. We know how to manage conflict. We just don't always emphasize it enough. Trust grows through common understanding of issue, science, and the status of conditions. Communication is essential. Cooperation on common objectives. And the examples we have are like the studies that have been done in the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program on Delta smelt and reorienting to recovery of salmon. Constructive dialogue is essential. Cooperative venues are essential. Collaboration on science studies and independent science panel evaluations. All of these help us in talking to each other, to get to know each other, to build trust, and to manage conflict so that doesn't dominate the only thing we do. We just don't do it enough. We need to invest in growing capacity. These things take time, and they take people, and they take capacity. We need to invest in growing capacity and also in balancing the power structure. The reason that conflict is necessary is because power is not always equally balanced, and sometimes that's the only way to help balance it. But we do have to invest to do that. We can also accelerate the use of adaptive management much better than we can today. So there's room for this to improve and help us accelerate adaptation itself. Flexibility and nimbleness are, in theory, can be accelerated by the use of adaptive management. And passive adaptive management, learn as you go, allows flexibility in the face of uncertainty. But a couple of things that we've learned is that, first of all, adaptive management experiments, which the adaptive management purists say is really the only adaptive management, are really difficult in this system, not only because of not only legally, but it's really hard. For example, if you want to adaptively manage with using water, it's really hard to get enough water or too little water to look at the extremes because of the way it has to be managed. We should learn about this from the past, and when we design adaptive management experiments, think about that. But more important, adaptive management requires what I've talked about before: trust, and it requires collaboration. And both have been in too short a supply. We have multiple agency cooperative venues, but those are not sufficient, or have not been sufficient, to pull off impressive adaptive management experiments, because the collaboration and cooperation has to start from the very beginning, from concept to plan to implementation to outcomes to feedback to policy. Requires a village. It involves everybody being involved. And the venues for adaptive management and policy ties have also been difficult to sustain. Underlying all of the accomplishments that we've done before, and underlying what we need to move forward, are communication, cooperation, and collaboration. This triangle represents the amount of effort that we put into each at the moment. Most of our time is spent with mission-specific silos, and appropriately so, probably. But improving how we communicate, cooperate, and collaborate is really important. I've listed some accomplishments that we've had in each one of these areas, but what I think we need to think more about is that as you communicate, cooperate, and then collaborate, intensity increases, there's an increase in demand for capacity, an increase in investment is necessary, and they're also very cumbersome and seem to be time consuming. But the benefits, these are the ways to push forward thinking. They benefit adaptive management. In fact, I would argue that it's actually more efficient to do things collaboratively in the long run than it is to force top-down solutions. Because collaborative solutions, once we come up with them, are more likely to be sustained if everybody has bought in. And also, as we go up this triangle, we increase trust, we increase common learning, we increase the success of adaptive management, and we're more likely to increase science and policy ties. So investing and emphasizing the importance of communication, cooperation, and collaboration is important to the future. So I've just put together 6 of probably many lessons that we've learned about managing an unpredictable and rapidly changing future. First of all, lesson 1, this is a wicked problem. We, of course, need to accelerate flexibility, nimbleness, and the pace of adaptation. But we can't expect a final solution. There's no simple, single answer that's going to solve this. This is a slog forward, and we have to accept that our goal is progressively incremental, more effective management of our co-equal goals. Ongoing learning is essential to that. We have to continue to invest in science and communicating that learning. Timely adaptation requires building trust. Conflict slows adaptation, but conflict can be managed. We can't expect linear progress, but it's really important that we do recognize the progress that we've made, not take it for granted. And many of the tools necessary to take advantage of the lesson learned are available. Maybe they're not always used to the extent they can be. We can certainly refine and improve those, but we do have a base from which to build here that not everybody has in most ecosystems across the world. If I can do a few aspirational recommendations here at the end, probably nothing that will shock anybody, but we need to use uncertainties about regulatory effectiveness or unanticipated events as opportunities to learn rather than using them as an opportunity to grow advantage for one faction versus another, or an opportunity to argue. Incorporating adaptive management into new regulations as it's beginning to be incorporated now can't be done easily. That's going to require more cooperation, coordination, collaboration, and trust than we have today. These are great ideas in theory in terms of flexibility and nimbleness, but they require cooperation, coordination, collaboration, and trust. We have to explicitly invest in capacity, time, and people for forward thinking to occur. Building trust and building coalitions require the same. And outcomes achieved through appropriate collaborations in the end, as I said before, are probably more sustainable than those imposed from the top down or from closed rooms and handed out like a pizza. So that's my lesson for today. Let's not take advantage of the past. I hope it's helpful to think about the exciting talks that we're going to hear about coming up in the rest of the symposium. And thank you for the invitation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Luoma. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but we are going to roll into our first activity of the day. So I have my assistant, Rachel. She will be helping for this part of the morning activity. So this part, you will need your own computer or phone to follow along with the activity. So folks online, get ready to do that, and people in the room also get ready. If you don't know me, my name is Tricia Lee. I'm a senior environmental scientist with the Delta Science program. And we're gonna start taking some of these things that we heard from Dr. Luoma this morning as we're looking forward to the 2025 Delta Science Plan and kind of incorporating those ideas into how we can set up to try to improve this type of communication and collaboration and improve things like experimental adaptive management and how we can plan for doing that. So I wanted to briefly remind everyone or give a little feedback on some of the feedback we've received so far on our Delta Science Plan planning. We had this Jeopardy Town Hall at the Bay Delta Science Conference last October. Lisamarie also mentioned this. And during that town hall, we did a Menti, so it's this online survey part, which we're also going to be doing today. And this was really done to gauge the audience's use of the Delta Science Plan and what their perception of effective planning for science looks like. And so we had, we had some people who were somewhat familiar with the Delta Science Plan and some people who had not really used it before. And that's where we're going to be working on in this space. And some things that we heard that people really wanted to see in this next Delta Science Plan are things like collaboration, for it to be interdisciplinary. We heard about equity. So we're really trying to branch out into these areas. So in today's morning activity, we're going to be going through elements of the 2019 Delta Science Plan. You do not have to be an expert on the Delta Science Plan or even really be that familiar with the Delta Science Plan. We're going to walk through it. And we do want to use this opportunity to hear from all of you about your experience with the Delta Science Plan or what you might want from something like the Delta Science Plan. So looking at this diagram that Lisamarie provided us with earlier, there are these two boxes in the center, and Lisamarie talked a little bit about reviewing the grand challenges, how we came up with those grand challenges. And the other half of this update to the science plan is going to be this review of the 2019 Delta Science Plan progress. So we're going to talk about that a little bit this morning. And this exercise is going to help us better understand what the Delta Science community found useful about the Delta Science Plan and where there might be room for improvement. So this is where we're going to get into a little bit of a review for the Delta Science Plan, of the 2019 Delta Science Plan. The 2019 Delta Science Plan had been framed around these objectives, which are these 6 things at the top that are strengthen the science management interface, coordinate and integrate Delta science in a transparent manner, enable and promote science synthesis, manage and reduce scientific conflict, and support effective adaptive management, and maintain, communicate, and advance understanding of the Delta. And these were color-coded, and we had all kinds of actions inside these chapters that addressed those objectives. So there were 26 actions. They're not pictured on this slide, but we'll get into them in a little bit. And they were organized under these 4 chapters to share mechanisms to inform policy and management, modernize, integrate, and build the Delta science infrastructure, support effective decision-making through science-based adaptive management and decision support tools, and collectively support implementation of the Delta Science Plan. So this organizational structure, as a reminder, I guess I should have said this at the start, this update to the Delta Science Plan is our 3rd iteration. So this structure for the 2019 Science Plan was really just mimicking the 2013, the original Delta Science Plan. And now, as Lisamarie mentioned, we're kind of going in a different direction. We've come up with these grand challenges. And so we're hoping to have a little bit of feedback on this concept. So these are the grand challenges that Lisamarie mentioned earlier. And this again was to address that comment from the Independent Science Board that the science plan should be really much bolder, more flexible, and more strategic. And we really took that to heart, and that's where this grand challenges concept came from. So as we reviewed the implementation of the 2019 Delta Science Plan to prepare for the 2025 update, that's where we started to shift our idea from just, this framework where there was just these objectives that were retrofitted up to the chapters to this grand challenges concept. So we're proposing this shift in the framework of how we're going to organize the Delta Science Plan. So we have a Menti. This is where you're going to need your own device. you're gonna wanna go to menti.com and enter the code on the screen to get started on their questions. The first question is an easy one, we hope, get you engaged. You can also talk with your neighbor. And we're gonna take just a minute or so to get everyone online and answering the Menti. I won't be able to live share the results, but we will be reading out some of them.
We have one result so far. So we'll give folks a few minutes. Okay, so far, most comments are responding saying, I support these grand challenges. Handful of folks have no preference. There is at least one response, few responses supporting the chapters and objectives, but overall, majority of folks support the use of the grand challenges. It's about 25 responses so far.
Okay. All right. Thank you for your responses. We're going to move on to the next part. So thinking about what these actions and objectives were. This next level of detail associated with the 2019 Delta Science Plan, we had these actions and objectives, and this table is broken out for you to be able to hopefully see a little bit better. Hopefully this is large enough for you to read. And you can see how these different actions aligned with the objectives, which were color-coded. So one action might have multiple objectives that it would address through implementing that action. And as an example of how these were in essence implemented, this list of things that Lisamarie presented earlier. This is some of the highlights that we had as an outcome of the Delta Science Plan. So again, they're not things that were just solely carried out by the Delta Science program. There are things that were carried out by many different groups. And so this science plan really helped us to create a coordinated approach to how we would carry out a lot of these tasks. So these are kind of the discrete tasks that were implemented through addressing the actions in the science plan. So the next question for the mentee, which will automatically come up if you're just still open on that page. We're hoping to take just a few minutes here to have people look at these actions on the screen and provide your feedback in the mentee. So what actions from the Delta Science Plan impacted your work? And even if you think that you didn't use the Delta Science Plan over the last 5 years, you might take this opportunity to see where your work fit in with these actions and objectives, because we do think that, it's not just that list of things that we provided as examples, but there may be other things that you feel that the science plan hit on that was impactful for your work over the last 5 years.
No responses yet, but some folks are typing away.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes on this one, so we'll just take some time to look at this.
Seeing some comments in here about peer review, as well as the adaptive management actions. One comment noted not specific actions, but some of the actions probably under Chapter 2 being relevant for them, participating in the State of Bay Delta Science. Chapter 3.4, developing working groups have been steadily increasing over the past 5 years. Science communication. Comments in here about Action 3.8 related to growing the collaborative modeling community. another mention of growing models. Someone said yes, use many actions in chapter 2 and chapter 3. Shout out for action 3.2, social science. There was a mention of action 3.6, which is develop a shared framework that broadly addresses the data lifecycle to support the goals of Assembly Bill 1755 and beyond. So related to data accessibility. Improving models, continued support for monitoring funding for HABS monitoring and research. Another mention of Bay Delta Science Conference, though not sure which action that was under. Someone said all of chapter 3. We have about 21 responses, so we'll get a few more. Action 3.3, of routinely evaluating monitoring programs. Another mention for just chapter 3 overall. The CHAB strategy and framework is great. All right, they're slowly rolling in, but we're getting more comments. So thanks, everyone.
All right, I'll give us another 30 seconds or so on this one.
And someone added 3.7 related to the availability of literature, scientific articles, data, and tools.
Awesome. Okay. So we're gonna move on to the next question, same slide basically, but the next question should roll up on your screen. So we want to take another few minutes to hear about actions that you feel like there wasn't that much progress on, or you felt like there could have been more progress on. So review again the actions and objectives on the screen and provide response on any area where you felt like there wasn't enough progress. And again, even if you think you didn't use the Delta Science Plan over the last 5 years, you might take this opportunity to see, where areas are that you felt like we should really continue to put some attention to, and that we should continue to address. We'll take a few more minutes for this one.
All right, we're starting to see some responses. Someone said chapter 5, that's collectively support implementation of the Delta Science Plan. Comments on actions 4.1 to 4.3. So those ones are related to the adaptive management and decision support tools. 2.6 would be nice to have more communication training for scientists. That's great. There's been a comment here about action 5.3, development of a web-based tracking system for science activities in the Delta being the challenge. Shout out to the Delta Science Tracker. Establish sustained funding for forward-looking science. I imagine that would relate to helping with a lot of these actions. Chapter 4 in general, feeling like a lot of the decision-making is still top-down. Action 3.5, establish sustainable funding for forward-looking science. That could also use some additional success and support. Someone noted here in general, the intersections of adaptive management with regulatory structures has been hard. So chapter 4. Another shout out to action 5.3 with the tracker. A request here for maybe more progress could be made on guidelines for science policy forums. Another ad for 3.5 related to sustainable funding. Chapter 2, or sorry, maybe action 2.5, helping scientists learn how to properly and efficiently or effectively communicate with each other and other stakeholders. Again, another note for funding to support data integration to improve data accessibility, visualization, and interpretation, and sufficient funding to support data synthesis. 3.9, noted here, someone noted that models are not developed across agencies and wish that there was a little bit more support in that area. Some other actions listed, I'm not going to read all of them, but 2.1, 4.2, 4.3, 5.1. So that's across the board.
That's great. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and I think this really speaks to, Dr. Luoma this morning talked about how far we've come, but clearly the work is not done. Feels like a lot of these we've made progress on, but we still need more progress. So really interesting. Thank you all for your thoughts on that. And let's move on to the next question. So another component from the Delta Science Plan, we had these appendices that were kind of tucked away at the end, but ended up being something that a lot of people were citing from the Delta Science Plan. So maybe you're not personally familiar with it, but I'll walk you through some of the examples of these appendices. And we'll also take some time to hear from you all on the utility of these appendices and whether you felt like they were impactful for your work. So there were kind of these two groups of appendices. One was informative. So a great example of this is this Appendix C was this science governance and the collaborative Delta Sciencescape. This was a really cool appendix where it walked through the different groups that work in the Delta and how they all kind of work together. And this network diagram was really useful in kind of understanding that walk between different groups. And then the other type of appendices that we had were these policy and procedures, which I think some folks also found really instrumental or useful for their work, where we laid out some clear how-tos for how to put on things like an independent scientific review. And there are also the standards that we adhere to when we put on peer reviews or hire science advisors. So these are things like scientific review, science advisors, science workshops, the policy and procedures for research funding, as well as conflict of interest for how funding is distributed and how we adhere to conflict of interest. There's kind of two different types of appendices in the science plan, both these informative and these policy and procedure types. And so the first question on this should be pretty quick. This is question number 4.
A handful of responses so far. And they're rolling in, so I'll probably wait to share, but so far we at least have some responses suggesting that all of these were referenced, or at least folks were aware of them. So far, Appendix C, the science governance one, shown up here on the screen right now, is getting the most responses, noting that people are at least aware of that or are using it. Second most would be Appendix H, the independent scientific review. Same with the independent science workshops. But others at least were aware of the independent science advisors appendix, same with the research funding and the conflict of interest policy. Still the most though for Appendix C, the science governance one. We have about 15 responses so far, so yeah.
Okay, that one was kind of quick, so we'll move to the next one. Okay, so question number 5. This is to give us a little bit more feedback on the utility of the appendices. So again, even if you think you may not have used these, maybe answer from the perspective of where your work might fit in or might benefit from the use of these appendices.
Similar responses to the last one, but actually our front runner now is Appendix K, which is related to research funding. Maybe that's actually tied with Appendix C now. So science governance and research funding, a lot for the independent scientific review. These are all things that folks would like to see updated in the next science plan. And we have 22 responses on this one so far. Yeah, mostly related to, it's moving a lot, but mostly the top are Appendix C, science governance. Folks would like to see that updated. Same with independent scientific peer review and research funding.
All right.
Thanks.
Yeah, this Appendix C, we are very curious about as well, and hoping to have some version of it going forward. So it's great to hear what is useful or of interest for folks in their work. Okay. And I think one more minute.
I think it's steady at 25.
Okay. So we have one more question on these appendices. So we'll roll into that last question. And we want to know a little bit more about if there's something else that's similar to this kind of concept of informative appendix or a policy and procedure that would be useful. Do you have any other ideas of things that we could maybe be building?
I'd also maybe add to, if there were, from the last question related to some of these appendices you'd want to see updated, maybe add if there are specific additions to those
Yeah.
as well. I'm biased related to the peer review ones, but it'd be great to know if there's, other aspects that should be added to those appendices for this update. No responses so far, but I'll read them as they come.
Okay.
First one on here is really great. Online resources or data portals. Something about that to be developed. Constructing containers and convening groups in ways that facilitate the coherent application of science. So more about having some type of these informative or policy documents related to that. Science communication resources or best practices. Data governance, maybe that could be an expansion of Appendix C from the last one. Mapping data production, QA/QC, publications, tools. Someone noted here, the fragmented data ecosystem can make synthesis science really hard. Maybe perhaps one about power dynamics, something related to best practices for communicating science. A dedicated appendix for policy and procedures revolving around tribal ecological knowledge, or TEK. Adaptive management experiments, what are the procedures and pitfalls? Definitions of terms that are, that should be consistent across policies, a go-to living glossary.
Yeah, we love our acronyms.
Another note here for guidance for integrating tribal, community, and other relevant perspectives not included in the standard science policy interface. A note here about following our plenary that we heard earlier, maybe a document of successes thus far. Another note here for Indigenous knowledge protocols in coordination with tribes. Tools and practices for blending science and values in decision-making tools for trust and transparency building. Looks pretty steady on responses so far.
Okay, great. So the last couple of questions, now that we've taken a look at the different elements of the 2019 science plan, giving you a little bit of refresh your memory or for the first time see those different elements. We wanted to know, this is maybe for people who did use the science plan a little bit more, but beyond what was covered in the slideshow, were there other components of the Delta Science Plan that you found useful in your work? You can also reiterate any part that you did use, that we did already cover, just reiterate the utility of any piece. Because those are the pieces that we would want to continue to keep as we move into the update.
No responses so far. Science Tracker is a very useful tool. I appreciate how it organizes needs for infrastructure, approaches, collaborations, etc., across organizations and in a unifying way. There's a comment here about something useful from the last science plan being the groundwork laid by the social science extension specialists. Identifying science priorities was something useful. Referring to these common goals as supporting documentation when requesting time to work on projects, meaning, having that noted here is helpful for identifying what to work on. The science plan increased my trust in activities hosted by the Delta Science Program. Someone found the science plan to be useful to design research and highlight the community importance of work when requesting funding.
All right. Okay, so we'll move on to our final question for this exercise. We went through the elements of the 2019 plan, thinking about moving forward to the 2025 plan. Are there other things, thinking about at this like planning for science level, that you think would be beneficial to help your work? We didn't already talk about. Are there any other elements? Or maybe just a chance to reiterate something that you really are hoping for?
First one on here. How we're going to backfill for loss of federal support. Timely. Other information that could be useful in the next science plan, case studies or success stories of how science plan actions have been used. They're sharing more about some of those successes. We've heard that a couple times. Working with extreme events as natural experiments in a way, planning for disaster or extreme events as science opportunity. How can we always capitalize and learn from those? Great.
Yeah, very interesting.
Another note here of a glossary of programs or organizations and their mandates. Maybe that could be tied to the science tracker. It also could be, something that's expanded on that network diagram too. Provided paths to success with clear timelines if followed. Much more social science content. It's so needed in such a contested landscape. Links to data resources, not just papers and reports. Mitigating the spread of invasive species and possible effects on the ecosystem. Support for studying and piloting cutting edge technologies for monitoring. Directory of people working on or leading priority science actions. And maybe a note here about a case study and about why science isn't being applied when available and strategies for shifting that dynamic. Slowing down now.
Okay. Well, that is pretty much it for this morning activity. We're gonna go into a break, but I want to thank everyone for their time and participation. It was something to just kind of get us started thinking about these concepts. We're gonna do more breakout discussion this afternoon to maybe hear some more, have an opportunity to discuss with your peers. And so we're gonna reconvene at 10:45. We get a little extra time. There is plenty of coffee and snacks out in the atrium, so I hope you all take some of that. And I want to remind everyone that if you're thinking about coming in person for this afternoon, we have lunch. So we are gonna have lunch provided when we break for lunch at 12. So, and that is all due to our partner, California Sea Grant. So thank you to Sea Grant. And we will see you all at 10:45. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna move into our panel for the morning. And this panel is on Grand Challenge number 4. And so for this panel, we have Dr. Xoco Shinbrot facilitating from the Delta Science Program. And our panelists this morning are Zack Gigone from the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians and Dr. Nina Fontana from UC Davis. So there will be an opportunity for questions and answers later on. If you're online, please use the raise hand function and we'll get to you. And then if you're in the room, you can use your physical raise hand function and we will come to you with a mic. So I'll hand it over to Xoco.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Let's see if this works. Okay, Grand Challenge number 4. So I'm really excited to have this excellent panel come here to talk about Grand Challenge number 4, which, to remind you, other ways of knowing, especially traditional knowledge, also known as TEK, also known as indigenous knowledge, many words for this, are siloed from decision making. So, flip. So, and why? So I guess this slide is basically like why is this? So TK, which is what I'm going to use, has been kind of misunderstood and undervalued, that people can hear me. So to address this, the science program actually did a literature review a few years ago, focusing on what are the benefits, what are the barriers, what are the approaches to interweaving. And on the next slide, there's a figure on interweaving. But there's still very little like Delta specific literature on integrating these other ways of knowing. And we know from various contexts outside of the Delta, I mean, within as well, that science that includes these diverse ways of knowing can improve effectiveness of both science and other ways of knowing in the long term. So the council is kind of uniquely placed as a boundary organization to help bring together these various ways of knowing and is intending to create better management and practices by elevating these other ways of knowing through, for example, our panel, but also through the tribal and environmental justice issue paper and many other things that are happening at the council. This also is the launch of the Interweaving Roundtable series, which the main goal is to listen and learn about opportunities, challenges, and approaches to interweaving. And I provided this figure because a lot of people have asked me, what is interweaving? And I really like it because it kind of shows that the various layers in which diverse knowledge systems, including Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, practitioner knowledge, can be interwoven for this cross-fertilization of knowledge and co-production of knowledge. And yeah, so the Interweaving Roundtable series will be, we're organizing, planning, and implementing and co-developing speakers and themes and format over the course of around 5 events in summer of 2025. So stay tuned for that. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to our wonderful panel to just kind of introduce yourself, how long you've been at your position, and what you spend most of your time thinking about. And we can start with you, Nina. Make sure your mic is on.
Good morning. My name is Nina Fontana. I am a researcher at UC Davis. And as I'm sitting here, I kind of looked out the window and I could see the American flag blowing and the California flag blowing. And just want to acknowledge that we're also on the ancestral homelands of the Nisenan, Maidu, Miwok, and Miwok peoples. I spend a lot of time thinking about place. I received my master's and PhD in ecology at UC Davis, but I'm in the Department of Native American Studies. So when we think about silos, they exist in academia too. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in a multicultural household. My mom was from Ukraine, my dad is Italian, and my dissertation work focused working in Ukraine, working with Hutzels, which are highlanders and stewards of the Carpathian Mountains. And I really focused on centering the role of traditional knowledge and stewardship and when we think about environmental planning. And then I came back and I did a postdoc at the USGS, that agency has popped up quite a bit today, in the inaugural cohort of the future of fire. So what does wildfire management look like in the US? And it was 7 of us, people, scientists, in a room, and we had to wrangle and talk about what we thought the future of wildfire management would look like. And my role was to center cultural burning in that discussion. And there was a room of statisticians, climate modelers, right? So that interweaving, that struggle is real. And so I feel very honored and grateful to be on this panel to talk to you all and learn from you all because it's everywhere. Since 2021, I've really spent a lot of time focusing on cultural burning across various jurisdictions. I'm currently collaborating with tribal communities to develop and implement climate adaptive strategies on tribally acquired lands, which is really, really important. And then thinking about creating innovative emergency management tools and wildfire risk tools with tribal communities to identify cultural burning opportunities across jurisdictions. Because as we know, access to land is one of the key concerns among tribal and indigenous communities. One thing that I'm excited about that I'm working on is developing a practical guide for cultural burn practitioners to help navigate bureaucratic hurdles and permitting process across various jurisdictions. It remains very cryptic is the word I would come up with. And then if we get a chance, I do have a slideshow prepared, and that really is focused on California Indian allotments, which if you've never heard about them, I understand why it's not talked about, but I lead a research team, which is me and another person too. We go out and we are looking and assessing ecocultural values on allotments and looking at climate change, vegetation modeling, risk profiling, and mapping. So lots of interweaving opportunities. So essentially, I'm really passionate about working together to find practical ways to support essential stewardship practices in environmental policy and action while honoring diverse knowledges held by various communities, no matter where you are. And I think given the challenges posed by climate change impacts, this is particularly crucial. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Zack Gigone. My role is that I work as an environmental scientist for the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. I should note that I'm not an indigenous person. I'm not a tribal member at Shingle Springs. So my goal isn't to speak to anything that's not my experience, but our department is very small and everybody's pulled in a lot of different directions. So I'm here to just, convey some of the knowledge that's been shared with me by folks that I work with and tribal members that I work with. I've been at my current role for about 2 years. Prior to that, I got my master's degree at Cal Poly Humboldt, where I did research in the area of geomorphology. I studied erosion rates after a wildfire. So my background is a little bit different than what I'm doing now. Prior to being in this job, I didn't really have much experience working with tribes. So it's been a learning experience, but it's been a really awesome experience. And I think that I've learned a lot over the couple of years that I've been here. And my area specifically is focusing on water quality. So during the summer months, especially, a big focus on harmful algal blooms, other things like dealing with excess fertilizer runoff, high E. coli levels, a wide variety of things like that. And my work is always informed by working with practitioners of traditional ecological knowledge, making sure that we're focusing on things that are important to them and affect them, such as making sure the water is going to be safe in areas where they're harvesting certain plants, or making sure that it's going to be safe for certain ceremonial uses, or making sure that we're specifically focusing on things like salmon that are, important ecological and cultural species. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both for, just giving us a little bit of a sneak peek into how you got where you are. I think it's really important to acknowledge, like you did, Zach, just like where we're coming from. Traditional knowledge holders are different from tribal members who are different from people who work with the tribe. So so that's wonderful. I wanted to, since you both have prepared slides, I'd like to invite you both up. I think your slides are up next, but yes. And then we can move into audience question and answer. And I have a few questions in case we don't get any. So yes, go ahead.
So I'm going to share a project working with different groups, different agencies, and I would like to invite conversation, if you'd like, as we go through some of the aspects of this project that I'll be highlighting. This is several maps of California. You can see, and maybe you are all familiar with some of this already, but sort of the California Indian pre-contact tribal territories. And what I find really alarming or striking is how these territories have shrunk over time. And so you can see in the middle, these were the proposed reservations by Congress in 1851. None of those treaties were ratified. And so what we have left, and you probably have a hard time seeing on that far end map, is what's left today. So you have reservations, you have rancherias, and you have allotments. What's not pictured are land trusts, but you can see that there is a dwindling and why land access is so critical, and being at a state agency supporting that is something to kind of think about when you are engaging with tribal and indigenous community members. So this particular project was funded by the California Climate Action Seed Grant in collaboration with UC Davis, Beth Rose Middleton, and Jim Thorne's labs, the California Public Domain Allotment Association, California Indian Legal Services, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the goal essentially is to improve the understanding of the condition and climate risks on these lands, and to support Indian allottees to steward and enhance the allotments in the face of climate change. So it's very much of a interweaving initiative attempt. And so that's why I'm talking about it today. On its face, it may not seem like it's directly related to water, but fire and water, if you're an ecologist or if you have any experience working with fire, they are very much connected in terms of recharging springs, water quality, water health. So I think when we think about silos, and Zack and I talked about this yesterday, like, you know, they're connected, and kind of acknowledging that when we think about stewardship is key. So the Dawes Act of 1887, a little bit of history. I know Sam talked about history this morning. So it was essentially, the policy goals were to force private property ownership and farming, and to break up collective Indian land. And so there were up to 160 acres available to individual Indian people that were held in trust by the government. It could be within reservations, or it could be on public domain. On the large reservations, these allotments were divided, and the goal was to reduce land holdings for natives. And because the treaties weren't ratified, these public domain allotments were one of the few ways California Indian people could obtain recognized land rights. So these allotments are actually very, very crucial and important in the state of California. So many of these public domain allotments are important because their residences on them, their family gathering places, their cultural places. They can't be sold. They've been in families for generations, and they're important for animals, plants, and non-human relatives. That's a bummer that slide didn't show up. But basically they're important because they serve as these last land holdings for California Indians. So the starting point of this grant was these surveys done in the 1990s by UC Extension. They were commissioned by the BIA, and they completed this inventory of ecological, surveys looking at hydrology, soils. Maybe some of you have seen some of these types of surveys. They did note some accessibility notes, but the implicit values of these biologists going out there were, is there space for grazing, and what are the timber values? Those were the values really guiding these surveys. There used to be over 330,000 acres of Indian allotments. Today, there's only 16,000. And this is an incorrect number. It's not even 423. There's about 316. So you probably can't see it, but this is what some of these reports look like, and they were completed all across California. And when we got this grant, it really was trying to update them, but update them in a different way. And the way that we wanted to do that was to work with California Indian allottees and figure out, well, what values really matter to them? It probably isn't timber, and it's probably not grazing. It may be, but there's probably other values too. And so we kind of moved away from the BIA values, and we started to talk and work with allottees to figure out what they wanted. And the hope is we can reevaluate those land conditions, look at climate change modeling with the hopes of planning and implementing native land stewardship. And we know wildfire risk is a huge issue. And a lot of these allotments have been burned through because they have not been stewarded. They've been neglected. And so as a result, when we think about community safety as a whole in California is impacted as well. So this is an example, and I'm sorry if you can't read it, but we ended up creating a stewardship potential rubric as a way of trying to interweave these values. And it's not, perfect, but it's an attempt to communicate, okay, what are the values that we're going out and looking for, and what are the values that matter for knowledge holders, for elders who are going to go out there and maybe gather. Some allottees have not had access to their allotments. We may be able to go out there and do these surveys, but they themselves may not have that access because of that's not where they live. It's in the middle of nowhere. The road is blown out. So these were the criteria that we came up with California Public Domain Allottee Association, which is a nonprofit. And the first question is, can you get to the allotment? And then we looked at vehicle access. We looked at parking ease. We looked at evacuation routes, things that matter to those community members. Are there gates? Are there berms? Is there private property surrounding the allotment? Because if there's private property surrounding the allotment, then you have to have a friendly neighbor. If you share a road, like all of these access issues are really critical. Are you comfortable while you're there? So when you're communicating, steepness of terrain, water, vegetation, can you walk through, right? Those are all ecological values, but what does it mean to a community member? Am I comfortable while I'm there? Can I sit down somewhere? Is there shade, right? And so this is something that, we get all of our numbers and we crunch them, but then how do we communicate it to community members? Well, are you comfortable while you're there? How steep is it? Can you walk on an even ground? Is there a reason to be there? So we look at vegetation types. We look at presence of water. We look at presence or absence of culturally important species. So we know oaks, for example, are a really culturally important species all across California among all the different diverse indigenous communities. We know that redbud, right? There's certain things that are very well known. And so we kind of keep an eye for that. And then are there concerns? What's the wildfire risk look like? Are there invasive species? Is there disease? Is there evidence of grazing? Is there trespass? Is there encroachment? So this is sort of a translation tool that really thinking about, people who have access, who are on the land versus the values that you're gathering or the numbers you're crunching, right? How do you translate those two? So I can share a story of one allotment to give you an idea of what this journey has been. We're focusing on Fresno County. There's no way we can do all 400 with a team of 2 in 2 years. Our hope is we'll get more funding. But in the meantime, is really kind of creating a case study for Fresno County. The reason we chose Fresno County is we had a lot of contacts there and a lot of colleagues and friends who are allottees that have been really helpful in guiding the nature of this project. We have done some surveys up in Alpine County and Washoe territory, which has also been really interesting when thinking about diversity of landscapes and ecosystems. So I'm working with a graduate student, Landon Noland, and we have to get to the allotment, right? And so we knew that we knew the area we were going. We had all the data points to kind of figure out, okay, we're going to go to this allotment. We got the shape files from the BIA. And so we went up a US Forest Service road, and then we stopped because this is what we saw. The road itself had been blown out. And so we had to kind of hike down this. It wasn't a very steep ravine. The picture makes it look more dramatic than it is. But we hiked down, came back up, walked through, and had to hike about a mile. We had parked our car. And so this road closure was in multiple directions. Even to get to the allotment was very difficult. You had to have all-wheel drive. You had to be able to hike. If you're a community member with any mobility challenges, it would not have been possible. So when we think about safety, it made us think about like, well, evac routes. What if someone was out here? What if there was a wildfire? What if something happened? Emergency services. Other allotments that we've been to, we've seen it's landlocked. So getting permission to even go there, there are gates. You don't know if you can go there. It doesn't, thinking about safety. So these are all things that we've encountered throughout our research trying to go out and do these surveys. One thing that's been helpful is looking at the old surveys from the 90s. And so, a lot of the old surveys talk about fire behavior, there's stream and water classification, vegetation and timber, where they kind of just assess, okay, this is an annual grassland or this is montane hardwood, but there is really no individualization of what's on the allotment. It's just sort of like cut and paste from CNPS, for example. What's been really cool is we've been working with the data team from Jim Thorne's lab. And too bad I can't move and do this at the same time. But from the historical survey, you can see this map. And you can see there's annual grasslands, and then you can see that there's montane hardwood. They were able to get nape imagery from 2023, and we see, okay, that's where the grassland would be. And then, okay, that's where the montane hardwood would be. And then the warm colored image, these are the projected vegetation types. And you can see grassland, montane hardwood, and blue oak. So these are climate change models saying, okay, this is what we anticipate is going to be there. So that's been really cool, is looking at the old historical surveys, then bringing in data, new data, to then go out and see, okay, what's going on. So this is what's going on in a photo. So this was the grassland that we were able to survey. There was a fire that had gone through. And so the next photo, you will see some of the impacts of that. Some of the manzanitas out there were huge and just so scarred and heavily impacted by a wildfire. This is like a pretty, I don't know, bland photo in comparison to what we saw. And so as we're doing these new surveys from California Native Plant Society, right? We get to kind of go through and say, okay, this was the grassland, and that montane hardwood is now chaparral because of the fire, right? The changes in wildfire on the landscape. And then as we list species, we're actually listing culturally important species that allottees think are important, they want more of, if we end up seeing it on the landscape. And so the idea is we're going to integrate all this different type of data to inform eco-cultural stewardship for the future. So we have the historical survey data, we have the new vegetation survey data, we have the stewardship rubric, which is a translation tool. We have climate modeling, we have fire risk data from the John Battles Lab in Berkeley. And we want to work with allottees and the BIA to create a stewardship plan. And that's really key. Getting fire on the landscape is pretty tricky on these particular allotments. Because as we know, the first to respond is the state agency, but the regulatory agency is the federal government. I'm gonna skip through this. This might be interesting. This is kind of cool. So this you can see Google Earth, and then the creek fire that blew through there in 2020, and that impact. And you can actually see it in these in this graph. So NDVI measures basically active plants, like how active those plants are at a particular time in the season. And you can see the creek fire. There's that little red arrow, the dip in 2020, and the impact on that allotment, which is kind of cool. And so these are the next steps. We're working on navigating the bureaucratic processes and permissions for thinning and burning. And allottees, we had a conference in August or May, forget, August last year. And we did a lot of sharing of these results, and we did a lot of surveys asking allottees what they want to see. So that's also really key, is like updating communities. This is what we're doing. These are the issues we're having. These are the directions we're seeing, and getting that feedback to continuously guide the nature of your work. If you are curious to learn more, there's a QR code. But really the goal that allottees have stated is wanting to promote plants, promote ecosystem types and processes, ecosystem processes. So for medicine, for basketry, which I'm sure Zack will talk more about as well in his work.
You're next. Let me make sure that your slides are up. If you have questions, think about it, write it down. We will have time for questions after Zack starts his presentation.
So I'm going to get into a bit more of the kind of specifics about my experience with working with folks in our traditional ecological knowledge department, and how we've been able to help incorporate TEK with Western science approach when we're making decisions around what to monitor water quality for, where to monitor, how to respond, and things like that. So for a bit of background, the part of the reason that I was brought in and hired for my position was due to the threat of harmful algal blooms. There's been a lot of those that were spotted at a number of locations, important locations on the Sacramento River between 2020 and 2022. So in response to that, the tribe began a testing program with a specific focus on culturally significant locations. So in particular, I'm concerned about, we have folks harvesting riparian plants at a lot of spots that are along the river or adjacent to it. So what is going to be the threat to them if working with those plants involves, basket making through putting plants in your mouth? Is there a route of, oral ingestion that can be of particular harm that might not be as much for the general population? So there's a lot of things like that that really have to be addressed that are kind of outside what you might typically think of for recreation or stuff like that on the river. And there has been some effects since I've been testing. We've detected low levels of cyanotoxins, the toxins that result from harmful algal blooms, and we've had to cancel a language class, cancel a couple of events for elders due to that threat. So even if it's not quite as much as before I began, we have still had some impacts, and that's something that we've had to continue to respond to and address. So as part of that, we have set up a text message alert system for tribal members that we can let people know if there is a threat, if there is, a certain body of water that you shouldn't be going in, shouldn't be spending time near. And we try to just, get this information out and get information that's going to be relevant to people when they're making their decisions. And in addition to just conducting that testing, we really try to get involved with other departments, with the community. So I've, for example, been writing some articles in the tribal members newsletter about what the things are that I'm doing when I'm testing the water quality. I've, written about a number of different testing items that I'm looking at, such as like the importance of maintaining dissolved oxygen levels for fish habitats, the effects such as flows that are affecting the levels of harmful algal blooms that we're seeing and stuff like that. And I especially try to get the youth involved with hands-on activities. So for example, this past summer, I did an erosion control contest. I set up these simulated erosion plots with drainage, and then I had them go collect things like grass and leaves and sticks and do their own little erosion control on each one of the plots. And then I tested how much sediment was in the water on each one of those. And I think, having stuff like that really helps get people thinking about that, especially the kids, and kind of, drive the point home in a way that just talking about it might not. So as we get more specifically into talking about TEK, I think one of the really important things is that it can't really be commodified, and using traditional ecological knowledge needs to specifically involve its practitioners and specifically involve indigenous people that have this knowledge. I've seen throughout my time at this role attempts to kind of commodify it. We had some folks that were talking to our TEK department that wanted to try to pull their knowledge together to develop like an AI model to use TEK for making ecological decisions. And there's, stuff like that I think is just a fundamental misunderstanding of what traditional ecological knowledge is. More so than just like a tool that can be used for ecology. It's really like, culture and a way of life. So, for example, our Vice Chair Tayaba has this quote that she says that ecology is culture and culture is ecology. And I think that really like sums it up very well. So, using the term of traditional ecological knowledge is a way to kind of get that across, but it's so much more in that it's cultural practice is very place-based, very spiritual-based, and something that you can't just, try to silo off and use as a tool. So like we just heard about utilizing fire, stuff like that, you can't specifically silo off like, here's the water, here's the forestry, here's the fire, whatever, because it's all just interwoven, and it doesn't work that way. And another important concept that I would like to bring up is talking about data sovereignty. This is something that, for example, some of the grants that we've utilized for water quality testing, as we're making these decisions on where to conduct water quality testing, a lot of these are important cultural sites, they're historical village sites, they're, gathering sites and stuff like that, that are really important knowledge that in many cases needs to remain private and remain within the people who have a history with that and are involved with the tribe. So a lot of those things are important that we should be able to make the decisions of what this knowledge is being used for, what the information that we collect is being, who it's being shared with, who has access to it, and what they can use it for. And I really like this quote. You have it up here, so I won't read it out, but just being able to not be like treated like a child, I guess, for some of these grants, it's so much kind of transactional, like, oh, we get the funding to be able to collect some water quality data, and in return, you have to do this with it, you have to do that with it. So I think that when I think about data sovereignty, it ultimately comes down to tribes being able to make the decision of who they want to share their data with, what can be done with it, and just being treated like a sovereign nation, like they are, in sense of being able to make those decisions. And yeah, I think that's all I have. Thank you.
They're both wonderful. I love the use of photos because I feel like traditional knowledge, TEK, indigenous knowledge seems very kind of abstract, and then you see pictures like on the landscape, and it's like practices that are being and knowledge that is being applied today and updated and used. So really appreciate kind of bringing to life for the audience TK, TEK, and kind of this interweaving approach. I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for the audience, both online and in person. We're going to go back and forth between both. I'm going to kick us off with the first question, but then we're going to get questions from the audience. So the first question. So there's this long-standing history of indigenous resource management practices like cultural burning being suppressed or criminalized or destroyed. And some states like California are starting to recognize, acknowledge, and repair some of these historical wrongdoings through things like the Truth and Healing Council, which Governor Newsom established in 2019. The question, so what's critical, would you say, for government agencies to know and to put into practice when working with tribes to interweave knowledges?
Sure. So I think one of the related to what you mentioned with that that stuff being criminalized, there's been, I think, a lot of cases where, okay, things like using certain species as indicators of ecosystem health, or doing cultural burns, or a ton of different things like that were just looked upon for such a long time as pointless or superstition or whatever. And now that we're experiencing more impacts from wildfires, from climate change, people are suddenly clamoring to want to know about these land management practices. And it's really important to understand that this knowledge is very place-based, it's very cultural-based, and it can't be separated from that. It can't be siloed. It can't be separated from its practitioners. So any usage of traditional ecological knowledge really has to, involve the people who practice it. In my time in college, like a while back before I started this job, I had the opportunity to work with a researcher who was studying on a reservation in western Montana the fire history, using tree core data to reconstruct the fire history. We were able to find evidence of cultural burns that were conducted like really far back, hundreds of years ago. And just, there's that history. If we think of this dichotomy between untouched wilderness land and land that's been, managed by humans, but there's so much of this this management by indigenous people that has been so much overlooked. And I think we need to think about that like more holistically as we're trying to incorporate this into land management.
To build off of what Zack mentioned, I think being in spaces with indigenous leaders, my feeling is that TEK, or indigenous knowledge, or native science, or indigenous science, is not just data, it's very existential, meaning that their work isn't divorced from their identity. So when you walk into a space and you see that, the work that's being done is related to language, it's related to food. It's very personal. And I think if we have jobs where we're like, oh, we go to work and then we go home and then we have our family, I think realizing that it's connected kind of gives a sense of, oh, this is really meaningful. And it's not just data, it's like lives. So that's been really helpful to like understand that it's existential in some ways.
Yeah, love both of those, the place-based component and it being necessarily tied to the people that hold the knowledge and just, yeah, the existential nature of that knowledge. Really good points. I want to make sure that there's time for audience questions. I wanted to first check in the audience and then online. If you want to ask a question, you can start using the raise hand function. So I want to turn to the audience and see what questions. And do we have a mic runner? Perfect, we have one right here.
Thanks so much for, you'll hear me? Yeah. Thanks so much for being here and just opening up this big topic. This is sort of like a question space, so respond to it however you want. One of the things that I think about a lot in working with my tribal partners in this whole question about how braiding occurs is that in my ecologist mind, I'm like, this person is actually co-evolved with this place. So the information around how to be is like an emergent expression of this dynamic being in this context. And some of my indigenous friends are like quick to say that they're on their own reconnection journey. So they're, in the process of actively discovering what that whole emergent relationship looks like. So it feels to me like there's something beneath the whole concept of braiding that's much deeper, that's about kind of recognition of what it means to have a co-evolved human as part of a functional ecosystem. And I guess I'm just curious to hear about your own respective experiences kind of in that realm and how you're trying to bring it into the day-to-day of the work that you're doing.
I just want to listen to you speak more, to be honest. It's time. I think there's no, can't replace time on land, time with people, time in community. And then understanding that each place and like co-evolution with place is different. I think sometimes people see, culture as like this monolith, like, oh, it's this is just, indigenous culture, but each place has such a unique co-evolution with that place. And I think the disruption of that co-evolution, as we've seen through colonization, assimilation, loss of land, which then results in loss of language, which then results in disrupting, aspects of those co-evolutionary processes, is time, listening, asking questions. I don't know, Zack.
Yeah, kind of related to that. So we're really fortunate at Shingle Springs to be able to have we have a language department that even though the language has been, for the most part lost, this language department has a lot of like anthropological documents and a lot of stories that have been recorded that they're using to be able to reconstruct the language, and they're putting on classes for the kids and for just all of the employees to be able to learn that. And the traditional ecological knowledge department is reconstructing, things like making tule boats or making certain types of basketry that have been lost. So, unfortunately, a lot of tribes aren't able to have the resources to be able to reconstruct some of those things that have been lost. But I think that ultimately, it's all tied together because the language is informing how you think about ecology, and the knowledge of what you're utilizing certain plants for enables how you see the ecology. So I think ultimately, like, all those things are tied together.
One thing that came to mind as you were talking about plants was one of, as different tribal communities are buying land back, is being involved in developing these monitoring plans that they want, and these stewardship plans that they want. And they're really awful documents, in my opinion, in terms of how to write them, but they're very necessary. So what I've been able to do working with certain communities is actually bringing language into that. So how you have to list the scientific names, and then working with elders and saying, do you want, the traditional name in here, and putting it in there. So now it's a document that's useful for that community. And going through their dictionaries and kind of like bringing all the words and then giving it back. That is one way that you can attempt, or I've tried to attempt, to provide value in some of these bureaucratic processes back to communities. But it's hard to do it in a way that meets community needs, which are very different than agency needs.
Yeah, great question and great responses. Just the importance of like remembering and reconnecting to culture, and doing that through language, like doing atlases, or, documenting, native names. So yeah, great examples. And I forgot to make sure when you are asking your question to introduce yourself. So I'd like to switch to see if there are any people online who their hand raised. Yeah, we're going back and forth. Yeah.
Yes, we have 2 raised hands right now. The first one that came in was Bryce Lewis Smith. You can unmute yourself and provide your comment.
Bonjour, Zack, Bryce Nadeznikas, Bodawalmin Dao, Nishnabin Dao. My name is Bryce Lewis Smith. I'm an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And I wanted to say thank you, Zack, for mentioning that Indigenous knowledge cannot be siloed or separated from Indigenous bodies and Indigenous lands. I think that's a really important conversation to be had, especially as we're looking at the impacts of colonization on our tribal communities and how that's left a lot of our tribes in like a resource deficit, right? Where our tribal youth are not being invested in, and we're not being able to step up into those positions of power to make decisions about our own lands at a state, local, regional, whatever level. I think everyone here who's interested in traditional ecological knowledge or wanting to figure out ways to integrate Indigenous knowledges into your projects, I think it's really important to recognize that there needs to be an investment in our youth, and making sure that the next generation of Indigenous leaders are able to access the resources needed to access education or early career internships to help them step up and get a leg up in this field. And I would like to learn more, Zack, about your programs that y'all are doing for your youth to prioritize the language, the culture, the youth, and like what opportunities are you seeing through UC Davis to like help uplift or remove barriers to higher education for Indigenous youth who are looking to get into this kind of work? Chimagwech.
Thank you. That's a very good question. So in terms of your first part about the youth, so I mentioned the erosion control contest that I did. I've been able to help out with a number of other activities involving just different activities that have to do with understanding waterways, understanding salmon, a bunch of things like that to kind of get some of the younger kids involved. But in terms of language, it's really cool to see the work that the language department has been able to do. They've put together things like activities. They put together like a bunch of different board games that they play with the kids at events and just get people kind of thinking about it. And it's really cool, especially during the summertime. There's a lot of my colleagues that have their kids around the office, and you hear the kids like saying stuff to each other in Nisanon, which is like, I don't know, just cool to see it coming back in a more natural way like that. And I can't remember, was there another part of the question too?
I'm just interested in learning more about how these youth can then continue to like find careers in like the environmental sector where they're able to get compensated fairly for their knowledge and expertise.
Yeah, so in terms of like kind of getting, folks involved early, we do have a youth internship program that one like cool success story is one of my colleagues in the environmental department started out in the internship program, and she was working for the environmental department since she was in like middle school, and then she went out and got a degree in restoration ecology, and now she's back as a person working at the department again and being able to bring that knowledge back. And I think that there's probably a lot of opportunities there. That's not something that I've been super involved with, but I do think that there's opportunities to be able to decrease those barriers and increase access to more higher education in that area.
Bryce, thank you so much for your question. I think training is a crucial element and really accessible way, like mapping. Mapping is such a useful and critical part of understanding landscape, and that's something that I've seen be really, really helpful in terms of providing resources back to communities, being in a state agency. I think compensation is really important for time and mileage. It's also really critical because to get folks to a place and then ask them for their time, I would say go to the community if you can. That shows that there's investment. Like short-term collaborations don't show investment. In terms of UC Davis, working with Indigenous students and supporting them has been critical in the allotment project, but also building a sense of community. There's the native nest, just ensuring retention, but also a sense of belonging and community, which is critical in spaces like higher education that can be really isolating. So I think thinking about what you can give back in terms of technical skills as an agency is could be of value when engaging with communities.
Great answers. I just wanted to add that it's not just on tribes. The question was kind of like resource, like what kind of resources can we provide to youth? And I think that that's a place where agencies have a really big role to play. And by resources, I guess I mean funding. So I know that, most recently we had a call for co-produced research. So this is a real place that it's like, okay, we need to educate the youth, but there's a huge role that non-tribal members agencies, can play. UC Davis also as a place for teaching and remembering. So great question. So switching back to the room, I think I saw a hand. Yeah, if we could get introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Laura Feinstein. I'm the director of the Resilient Landscapes program at San Francisco Estuary Institute. And actually, we're about to embark on a partnership with Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. So really excited to be here. I have a question that's a scenario. What I'm curious about is, let's say there's a California state agency that owns land in the Delta and they're planning a wetland restoration project. And they want to partner with tribes and apply traditional ecological knowledge in how they undertake that restoration project. What's the right way to do that? What's the way that they do that that feels to the tribes like they are being authentically engaged and not having their knowledge commodified?
I think asking why you want to do that, like why do you want to engage? Like understanding the role of why you want to engage, because that's going to be the first question. I cannot speak for said community, but just in terms of like community engagement in general is like really understanding why, and then understanding place, like doing the homework, like going, understanding what communities live there, understanding the language, understanding the place is critical. Zack, feel free to like riff together if you want.
Yeah, I think related to that, just giving these knowledge practitioners their due respect. You know, I've heard folks say that like even if they don't have the piece of paper to prove it, a lot of our cultural practitioners essentially have a PhD in TEK, and one like really positive success story that we've been able to do is our restoration ecologist has been involved with a project with the El Dorado National Forest in restoration from the Caldor fire, and they have a native seed bank. So our department has been able to, collect seeds from these native plants, propagate them, and work with the Forest Service to be able to restore these plants back in their native habitat. So that's obviously not going to be the case for a lot of tribes that don't have the benefit of a program like that. But, it's, I think, through like working with an agency like the Forest Service, just having our restoration folks and our cultural practitioners, given the same respect that you would for any sort of, consultant with a specific area of knowledge.
And to work through trusted community partners, I think that was in one of the documents. And taking the time, like actually build a relationship with the people that you want to engage with, and also thinking about what needs do they have. So instead of like TEK or IK can sometimes be a bookend, like it's like, oh, we want to put it in, rather than from the beginning have that collaboration, have that engagement really early on, and then like continue it even past the project to show that, you're invested in the outcome, right? Like the project doesn't end and then it's finished. It's continual engagement to really build trust. I think the trust part is really the key to prolonged investment both ways.
Yeah, just going off of that as well. I like what you said about, including tribes from the start, because I think that really treating tribes as the sovereign nations that they are, because in my experience, we've had some folks that maybe are well-intentioned, but have reached out to us like, oh, we have this 200-page document that's going out next week, and we want to have your input on traditional ecological knowledge. And it's like, we have limited resources and limited time to be able to review stuff like that and provide input. So I think that really, if you want to have tribal voices included, it needs to be, from the start, as you would with any other stakeholders.
And make it easy to participate. Like, don't use jargon, which is really hard, right? But like actively think about, how you communicate. That's a really key part. Make it easy. I've had to fill out grant forms where just getting the grant form, I had to like reformat it and rewrite it. And it's just, which is fine. But I think like that's a barrier of entry is just that communication part of really making it accessible and what that really means. And I think sometimes in our silos, we forget that access and words are different for different communities.
Great question. Great responses. I wanted to shift back to the online space.
Yes, there's 2 hands up. The next one is Daniel Ellis. Feel free to unmute yourself and provide your comment.
Thank you. As you said, my name is Dan Ellis. I'm a senior environmental scientist with the IP, and I work on a lot of wetland restoration projects, and I have a few others. One thing I think about with tribal knowledge, and you actually mentioned it, was how much was lost over years of oppression and atrocities. And I wonder if it's possible to create a resource, perhaps like a list of tribes and the tribal knowledge that they have retained, because that would be really helpful in finding colleagues from tribal communities to partner with. I can say as a scientist that I just wouldn't have the time to adequately research the history and the people, but I do have the interest to engage. It's just who do I reach out to? Who's the relevant party to reach out to? So I was wondering, is that a realistic resource that could be, constructed?
I think, well, nativeland.ca has you can look at ancestral territory. So I would start at looking at native maps. And then from there, you can identify communities. And then from there, there's state recognized tribes and federally recognized tribes. So understanding the distinction in sovereignty and legal frameworks. And then from there, you can go to the tribal websites or Facebook, different communities communicate in different ways. But I don't know if there's a list of partners that's collated already.
Yeah, I don't know of a list like that specifically. I think that really it unfortunately is probably gonna take a bit of time, but I think you kind of have to reach out to each tribe directly and go from there.
Kat Anderson has Tending the Wild, which is a good book that goes into a lot of the cultural ecologies all across the state. And if you're interested in learning more about that would be a good place to start. And it's a compelling read. But it does require work, but also just showing up to places, not unannounced or anything, but if there's a community event, and it's open to the public, show up. And engage and try to just talk to people. That's usually how things get done in a lot of these spaces, is reaching out to community and building those relationships.
Thanks. Yeah, I would agree that there's not a one-stop shop and all tribes are different. And there are knowledges that are competing, just like in science. So I guess I just wanted to underline what was previously talked about, which is just tribal capacity is limited. So making sure that you're, as much as possible, identifying the person that you want to be communicating with and not the chairperson, which is essentially the president or whatever. So that would be essentially like messaging President Trump. So finding, the historic preservation officer or TEK manager, those are people that would probably be best situated to respond to some of these more specific questions. So, yeah.
And there is, going off of that, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, there is an organized list of that. I can't remember specifically which state website it is on, but if you Google California Tribal Historic Preservation Officers list, there is one with contact information for everyone.
Great. Back to the room. Questions? No, we have one more online. Go ahead. And don't forget to introduce yourself.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. My name is Joy. I work with Zack Sewer. I was born in Nigeria and I'm kind of used to being in a tribe. I am from a tribe and you're used to. I was gonna ask a scenario-based question. So in the event where you have two tribes that have a conflict that has been for many years, some of those conflicts run deep, and you recognize that perhaps in one tribe there is a knowledge from the other tribe that you can use to help solve a problem or a situation that they have. And so how would you go by and like trying to help them without just like taking that knowledge and, you know, taking it from one community and putting it into another community?
Are they neighboring?
Maybe.
That helps with the answer.
Well, I guess if they were neighboring or if they're not.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, you're asking like if you are someone who wants to work with say practitioners of traditional ecological knowledge and you're seeing two neighboring tribes that have a conflict or different ideas about what that means, is that what you're asking?
No, so let me clarify. So for example, one tribe and where they live, they have a certain issue or problem or situation that you know that the other tribe has a potential solution that they can incorporate to help them with that problem. But because it's going to be hard to bring the two tribes together to kind of work with each other and share knowledge, how would you go by helping the other community, not just, and so that way you don't, you know, take one knowledge and incorporate it.
Reciprocity is key in a lot of relationship building. So sometimes being an outsider is helpful, sometimes it's not. But I think without knowing exactly what it is, it's very difficult. And also understanding that there's, as Zack mentioned, data sovereignty and indigenous data sovereignty is within community. It doesn't matter if it's two separate communities, they each have their own sovereignty to their own knowledge. So you can't just like take one, go and like, so those protocols and reciprocities still exist. So I would tread carefully with that. I think understanding too the place-based knowledge, you know, like I don't know what the solution, like the pretend solution is. So it's hard for me to think like maybe there is a scenario where it could work, but my gut instinct with just like the broad scenario is like there's a lot that you could potentially ruin and make things worse even, which I would not want to do.
Can I jump in? I kind of see like two possible ways forward. One that you kind of alluded to, which is like there is data sovereignty and there is reciprocity. So like if there is a way for the two tribes to collaborate, then like that's one way forward. I think a lot of the time we kind of lump indigenous knowledge together, but even like a lot of neighboring tribes, they fought about a lot of things. Like this is very common. The other idea is like, is there a role of external groups, for example, scientists that can play that are not necessarily using other indigenous knowledge, but going like in a solutions oriented way to help with a solution. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. Zack, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much more to add, but yeah, talking about data sovereignty, I think first of all, you would just have to go to the tribe that has the information and see how they feel about sharing it and kind of go from there. It's something that's going to vary quite a bit on a case-to-case basis, I think.
Great. Unfortunately, okay, cool. We can squeeze in one more. There's a hand raised online. Okay, great. We'll go to that.
The next hand is Lucy Gill. Please unmute yourself and provide your comment, please. Lucy, are you there?
Waiting with bated breath.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Gill, and I am a cultural resource manager for the Confederated Villages of Lishawn Nation. I was wondering, Zach, I really appreciated that you mentioned the importance of doing ecological monitoring in specific culturally important places. One issue that we have run into is that natural resource and cultural resource management are often very siloed from each other in Western science and in government agencies, but from a tribal perspective, as you said, they're completely intertwined. And so I was wondering, what strategies do you both have for working with agencies to better integrate not only Western science and traditional knowledge, but also natural and cultural resource management, since that's really important from a tribal perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And for me, it really just comes down to like, I guess I'm fortunate in that my office is right across the hall from some folks in the traditional ecological knowledge department. So, as I'm doing things like putting together a water testing program, deciding things that I want to test for, talking about applying for grants for restoration projects, stuff like that. Just anytime I'm doing any of those things, I always consult the folks in the TEK department and ask, what plant species, what locations, what bodies of water would be a priority for them, and kind of go from there. So, I think for me, it's pretty simple in terms of that, just, making sure that they have input on those decisions.
I agree. There's not much I can add to that. I think it's a challenge because I think the outcomes or the goals are different. Like I mentioned before, but the community needs and agency needs tend to be different. And I think there's a role that agency can play to address community needs or research gaps. But making sure that the knowledge holders are centered and they guide the monitoring plans are key. And I think Zach highlighted, what the process of doing that in an office.
Great. Well, join me in thanking our wonderful panel. And get a round of applause. And I believe we have a lunch break until 1:30. Do you want to hop in?
Also, major thanks to Xoco for facilitating. Okay, so yes, we do have a lunch break until 1:30. So in-person folks, please listen closely. So California Sea Grant generously provided us with lunch for our in-person participants. We are not allowed to eat in this room. So the box lunches are outside the doors, but we do have to go downstairs or outside to find a place to eat. So thank you so much for your attention, and we'll see you back here at 1:30. All right. Thank you everyone for coming back to open up our afternoon session of our Delta Science Plan workshop. We are going to open up this afternoon with the chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, Julie Lee, and she's going to be providing a few remarks. So Julie has been on the Delta Stewardship Council since 2022 and was elected to the chairship in April 2024. So please welcome Julie.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. I just want to thank you for having me here and for all of you being in attendance to help inform our next Delta Science Plan. I am someone who relies on the work that you all do. And so I just want to really, really thank you for being here today. And those of you online, it's great that we can all get together in person again. And I know that we had our first in-person conference a while back, and everybody was very excited to be here in person again. So I just want to really welcome everyone and say thanks for being here and welcome back this afternoon for this afternoon session. As a Delta lead scientist, Dr. Lisamarie Windham-Myers spoke about this morning. The key purpose of the Delta Science Plan is to coordinate and focus science efforts across agencies and entities to ensure that we're all working together to integrate ongoing research and monitoring. And this doesn't just happen on its own, it takes effort and a community like you who care about making it happen. The Delta Science Plan was the brainchild of the Council's former lead scientists. It's not a regulatory document, nor is it required by law, but it is a tool to help us better organize ourselves and strategically prepare for an increasingly changing Delta. The grand challenges that we are talking about here today highlight the difficulties of managing a complex system under novel and evolving conditions. And that can only be done well if we band together to tackle these issues. This is why I'm so heartened today to see the in-person and online turnout. I was especially interested in the conversation around Grand Challenges number 4 earlier today and the thoughtful example from panelists this morning regarding the integration of traditional knowledge into land and water stewardship. Beyond today's workshop, I'm excited about other upcoming work supported by the Delta Science Program, such as the work that will result from the upcoming Delta Research Awards and Delta Science Fellowship in partnership with the California Sea Grant. I'm also excited about the implementation of actions from the last Delta Science Plan, like the modeling collaboratory and the social science integration. So I thank you again for being here and contributing your time and ideas, and I hope you enjoy the afternoon presentations and the breakout sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Really excited to have you here with us today. So, and next up, we have Dr. Mark Lubell, who will be presenting on concepts around Grand Challenges number 3. Flows of scientific information remain decentralized and poorly connected to communities and decision makers. So please welcome up Dr. Lubell.
So just navigate from here.
Yeah. Don't use
the arrows. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for joining on this. I guess I got about 20 minutes to figure out how to solve, connecting science to policy in the Delta. Not an easy thing to do. This is the slide that was provided to me as sort of a cue on this about how the flow of information is decentralized and that you may have specialized forums on specific issues and that there's a lack of trust as barrier. So I think all those 3 themes will show up in some of the remarks I'll make here. So this is, the Delta Science Enterprise as written about in the Delta Science Plan. Delta Science Program is core organization of Delta Science Enterprise. It's a collection of science programs and activities that exist to serve managers and stakeholders in the regional system. And that network picture there was actually made by one of my students when he was a Delta Science Fellow. It could be updated now, but in that network you have all the squares are various collaborative science forums in the Delta, such as IEP and CAMP and CSAMP and things like that. And then all the circles are different organizations that participate in those forums. And so there, this is what we call a polycentric system. It's quite fragmented. There's lots of forums. Now there's even new forums. There's a social science working group now that was not there before. Lots of different actors coming in and out of the system. And science is developed in this type of polycentric science enterprise and delivered to policymakers. So how to get the science to policymakers, and this is kind of the core question. Many of you guys probably know this fellow. Recently passed away, Phil Eisenberg, a longtime California environmental policy expert, worked in all kinds of issues, former mayor of Sacramento. he looked at a network like that that was similar around the Bay, and in a paper that I wrote, and in a comment to my paper, he wrote this, which I've used a zillion times now, where he says public policy is almost always a mess. Let's acknowledge the inevitable and figure out how to manage a messy situation. Trying to define a policy problem is hard enough. Trying to find a solution is even harder. Trying to do either in a policy-making structure in which everyone is involved, but nobody is in charge is nearly impossible. And that's kind of what we have in the science enterprise, and pretty much all governance is a situation in which everyone is involved, but nobody is in charge. How do you get decision-making to happen in that? So to do that is really, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it is definitely the art of the impossible. How do we do that? So these are, I've done a lot of work on science governance in the Delta and other systems like this, and these are what I think are the key questions for science governance. What aspects of the Bay Delta system should we observe? We want to understand the problems, the way the system operates. It's kind of a lot of that is the realm of monitoring and natural science. So we'll collect a bunch of information, but how do we integrate it? How do we get the collaboration and the workflow to be integrated across the science enterprise so we can understand the system? And then once we understand the system, how do we link our understanding of the system, which is, a system that's changing, so our understanding needs to change. We need to have a holistic picture. How do we link it to actual decision-making and adaptive management in order so that the science does the best job of informing the management and the policy? And that's really kind of, I would say, what Grand Challenge 3 is aiming at, although those first two questions are also important. And then how do we sustain it? The science doesn't just come, magically from somewhere. There's these interesting creatures called human beings that are doing the science that need funding and time and that sort of thing, effort to be put towards doing it. And all of these sorts of questions, I think, are mirrored in the Delta Science Plan, where talking about recognizing complexity and the vision of one Delta, one science that has goals like strengthening science management interactions, coordinating and integrating Delta science. So those 4 key questions are really, from the kind of the social science perspective, are also reflected in a lot of the policy documents that float around in the Delta. So I've done a lot of research. I'm not going to go through all those, but for several years, I've been working in various ways on this, surveys, workshops, that sort of thing. There's a team of people that I've worked with on this, not just from UC Davis, but there's all their names up there. So some of these are some of the biggest scholars in work on policy learning and environmental policy. We bring some Colorado River experience into here too, but just to give you a sense, there's a lot that we've done. So out of all this, I'll just try to give you like a little snapshot here, how much learning has occurred, what has been learned. Here's one picture that comes from the Delta Science Stakeholder Survey that we did a few years ago. We went to all the collaborative forums that exist in the Delta and tried to get as many people to respond to an online surveys as we could get. And this is the top. At the top here is where people are somewhat satisfied versus dissatisfied. So, at the bottom here it says the dissatisfaction with monitoring, dissatisfaction with interpreting management implications of the science, dissatisfaction with solutions, and kind of up here in more in the top is things about integration that people are more satisfied with. So that's one of the ways that you can start to think about how people view the science, how much learning is going on. And then we also studied how people perceive adaptive management. So this is from the Delta Science Enterprise documents, the picture that's used to describe adaptive management in the Delta, the 3 phases: plan, do, and evaluate and respond, which are then broken up into sub-phases. So it is a type of learning process. So when we ask people in the survey, how effective do they think the various stages of adaptive management are, what they viewed as effective is identifying and addressing the nature of the Delta problems, the early phases, right? The plan phases. But as you get to the do phases, designing and implementing management actions, monitoring the effects, the do phases starts to go down here where influencing management in response to the science starts to go down. It's a little bit better in analyzing and synthesizing data. But if you look across these, basically anywhere where the science is kind of touching the policy in some fashion, people are evaluating the effectiveness of the science enterprise and the effectiveness of adaptive management lower. So that's some of the quantitative data we've looked at, and then some of the qualitative data that we've done in some workshops and also some interviews. We got at this question of like what we call learning moments. Like, what are the big learning moments, the big topics that the science enterprise has effectively identified and started to do some really good work on in connecting to policy. And these are some of the big ticket items: floodplain reactivation, the pelagic organisms decline, the role of nutrient management and sewage treatment plants in the Sac River coming downstream, more and more the human dimensions and the social science dimensions, ecosystem restoration. So those things kind of all line up as like, you know, big ticket findings or accomplishments of what the science enterprise has done over time. So those are, you know, that's kind of what those first few slides are like, thinking about what has been learned in the Delta. So I think maybe even more important to Grand Challenge 3 is like, what drives that learning? How do you figure out the way to accelerate learning and have more learning moments and better adaptive management, and people view all the learning opportunities as more effective? Well, one of the things is having lots of these forums. So this is a problem and a blessing and a curse, if you will, right? We have lots of forums: interagency ecological program, camps, you know, the water operations management team, lots of different forums that live in the science enterprise, and that's all those blacks or grayish squares I showed you in that diagram. This is from the survey, the number of percentage of respondents that people said they spend is their primary forum. So this is kind of like the frequency of participation across these forums. And the more that people participate across these forums, across the system, inevitably in all of our work, the more participation, the more they express that they learn things. And this is kind of an indicator of that. So in this one, what we did is we asked, if, like, for example, if you participate in IEP, we said, how effective do you think adaptive management was based on your experience in IEP? So we say, we asked them, you participate in IEP, do you think IEP has enough resources? Do you think it coordinates with the forums, other forums well enough? Do you think that there's enough representative engagement, like there's enough representation of different interests? Is there enough trust? Is there enough leadership? And all these things that are positive here are accelerators of learning. So leadership, trust, engagement, and coordination are the four biggest things that are driving learning within these forums. And resources are important, but they're actually much less important than these social drivers. It's the social drivers that are the keys to really getting things forward. Resources are necessary, but they're not sufficient. If you lose the resources, obviously there's no money, there's no human resources, it all falls apart. But that's not enough. You have to have these other elements of the science enterprise, these social capital sorts of elements that really drive the science forward. And this is a little kind of different scenarios for the different forms. So this is like simulating from the data a forum that's high social capital but low resources is the light green, and the dark green is low social capital but high resources. And you can kind of think as this performance on adaptive management. And what you see is like a high resource but low social capital forum does worse than a low resource, high social capital forum. So you really get that social capital being a really important driver. And one other study I want to bring up to you guys, kind of, you know, given the time, I could talk about more stuff, but this is another indicator from the survey about like what people are learning from the science enterprise overall. Drivers of the effects of Delta issues, perspectives of multiple disciplines, impacts of human behavior, science needs of different stakeholders, how science links to policies, and how the broader science enterprise is linked to the Delta functions. And what you see here is like the most agreement on understanding the environmental issues and the least agreement in how the Delta science connects to management. But then when you look at the types of people who learn, so what we have here in this axis is the years of experience in the Delta and the number of forums that people participate in as the two x-axes here, and the y-axis is how much learning people do. And the light gray lines are like staff, people who are scientific staff or technical staff of some sort. And as technical staff with more years of experience in the Delta and participate in more forums, they learn more according to how we measure it. But as executives, the people who say that they have executive function, the more years of experience and the more they participate across the system, it's flat. Either it's flat or they actually learn less, which means that it's much harder for the people that have executive level decision making in the agencies, the chairs, that sort of thing, to be able to learn from the science enterprise is much less effective than the people who are the more technical staff. And that's because of the disconnect with what their incentives, their expertise at the high level versus the staff level. And that disconnect is something that we really need to bridge. And here's some interview direct from the mouths of the participants. One of the challenges higher up, you're at a policy level, the more things you have to juggle, and so more information that you have to integrate. These can be technically oriented discussions, and you really have to be in the weeds. And nobody's, at the executive level, they're not in the weeds. But at the technical level, if you're technically oriented to have similar areas of interest expertise, you're kind of like working together in a scientific workflow, community of practice, that sort of participation in the science enterprise at the technical level really enables more learning to happen. So I don't want to say that executives can't learn at all. I think what they're doing is learning about different things, right? Different aspects of the system, the governance aspects of the system, but the nature of their jobs and what they learn gives them challenges to learn about the scientific aspect, and therefore also gives challenges about connecting the science to the decision making. Okay. Just a little bit more, this is from some Colorado River stuff. So we've done some similar work in the Colorado River about like when we get sorts of learning moments and when we actually get where learning is blocked. So we actually in the Colorado River look at like examples of when people say we tried to learn and it failed. And here's some of the things that came up as important drivers: collaboration, communication and trust, technical, experimentation, types of information, expertise, timing, and then structural, kind of the funding, consistent decision-making, focused goals. So that's another kind of ingredient list that we've looked at in terms of what helps accelerate learning. And all the work that we've done, last time I gave this presentation, that like in a lot of our work, the survey report, we did some camp CSAMP work, other workshops. We've kind of like at the end of all of them, we've tried to come up with some recommendations that we think are based on our empirical research, based on the experience we've had in the workshops. And so, here's kind of a laundry list of stuff that we think deserves some attention and fleshing out as far as like how to improve the science enterprise and its connection to science. At the high level, developing a strategic framework, which I do think is something that happens in the context of the science plan, fostering system level collaboration, such as the collaboratory, which has been brought up many different times. I do think that's a good idea. I like a lot of these ones, as creating new forums, like we have all these existing forums that have leaders, but those leaders don't talk to each other that much. We have something called DPIC as well, Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. I think we need a science version of that. Find all the monitoring programs that are working well, connect the monitoring programs that are viewed as working well together so they can learn lessons from each other. Just talked about this at lunch, developing the recognition that the Delta Science Enterprise is the source of the best available science. So when we do CEQA, NEPA, habitat restoration planning, all that stuff, and people say, hey, did you use the best available science? And they ask the courts, we can point to the Delta Enterprise as that. CSAMP and CAMP has an interesting integrated model that has executives and staff in the same kind of space and having ways for them to interact vertically, not just within that and some regular interactions. So I do think that the CSAMP CAMP model is something that deserves more attention from that perspective. We need money and we need training. So like for sustaining the science enterprise, I actually think like this room and listening to me is helpful because it like helps you feel better about the complex job that you're doing. It's kind of therapy in that way. But it also like makes it so that you recognize the complex environment in which you're operating and can think about it explicitly and not just like complain about it, but recognize it's a feature of the system and figure out how to navigate it in the best way. So all of those things are, some are more vague, some are more specific, but I think are kind of like provide some targets that could be for further discussion. And I'm probably out of time now, so yep, I'm all done. So thank you. And I have questions, I suppose, if people have them, or yeah.
Yeah, so we have time for questions. If you're online, you can use the raise hand function, or in the room, people can just raise their hand.
No questions, I solved all your problems.
Hello, my name is Xoco Shinbrot. I work for the Delta Stewardship Council. Amazing presentation. So much information. I feel like you could have given that in like 3 hours. I guess I wanted to go back to like, it seemed like there were two pieces of information which were kind of talking to each other. One was executive level learning and technical staff and just learning different things.
Yeah.
Where like executive level people are maybe learning about like the politics of how to get things done versus technical staff are more focused on the science. And the earlier slide about how, what was it? Leadership, trust, and engagement are like also very important for moving science forward. Is that?
Yeah, like, well, the way we measure it here is like perceptions of the effectiveness of adaptive management. So it's like an indicator of the performance of the system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And how much people are able to learn from the system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, it just strikes me that there is a gap between the staff and the executive and just how, we can't do everything, not everyone can't do everything. So like how you reduce that gap. And I feel like there's something related to the trust that is, I can't quite put my finger on. Anyways, it's more of a comment, but this is a great presentation.
Yeah, so the leadership part, right? There is within forum leadership. All these forums have chairs of various sorts, and they may be more or less effective at like herding the cats and persuading people to work together and things like that. But there's also political leadership at the executive level, supporting the science enterprise. All the way up to the level of the governor saying, yeah, we think the Delta is important and that sort of thing. And so the leadership comes in different flavors throughout the process, but without leadership at all those different levels, then the science enterprise and its capacity to develop knowledge and put that knowledge into practice and policy is going to be limited. So it's really important at all those levels. And that's one of the reasons I think it's important to start looking at research like mine and other social science research is that, so that you can be an effective leader in these complex, messy systems, because these messy systems are not going away, right? We're never going to be in a situation where this is not a messy, complex system. As a matter of fact, I should say, A part of the blessing and curse is like, it's amazing what the science enterprise in the Delta is, like how much of it is. There's a lot of systems that have nothing or very few. So if you want, like, this is what an investment in science looks like. It creates a big, messy system with lots of knowledge and lots of people. And there's, you know, how you make the most of that is what you need to think of. But yeah, there's that disconnect and is important, how you bridge that. And I do think the camp CSAMP model, if you look at the structure of it, does explicitly try to think about how you build these interactions vertically, not just horizontally within leadership or within science or technical teams, but linking across the system, because the leaders, like the policy leaders, it's like navigating the politics, making sure the budget's there, that sort of stuff. Not necessarily does, you know, nitrogen from sewage treatment plants lead to mortality in Delta smelt.
Thanks. Yeah, that's such a good point. Actually, there's a bit of that in the breakout discussions as well, talking on that point. So we'll take one comment or one question from the online audience next, and we have Sam Luoma. You should be able to unmute.
Hi, Mark. If you can hear me.
Yes.
This is fabulous work, and I think I really enjoy every aspect of it. But I was interested in the executive technical split out there too. Would that suggest that, I mean, executives don't, well, first of all, as scientists, we always think, well, if we could only talk to the executives, we could have an impact. This kind of says the opposite. But it seems to me then key people, and we've known a few of them over our times in the Bay Delta, a key person is somebody who has the ear of the executive, but also has enough experience and enough contacts, a big enough network to understand the technical stuff. Usually we think of that as having to be a scientist, but is it reasonable that key people to make this link are people who have contacts in the science community, but also are like the person below the executive? That's my first question. The second one is having to do with CAMP and CSAMP. As you know, I've been involved in that for a long time. Just so you know, it's been suspended. So
yeah, I did hear about that.
So I think finding it interesting in this regard, there's a set of agencies who just don't have the capacity to do it. But I'd like to get back to the executive technical question first.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, you know, I think what you're talking about is a person who's has a capacity to span the boundaries, right? Can kind of speak to both the science and the policy side. And, you know, I think those people can sometimes be scientists who are willing to translate their science in a way that the policymakers can understand it. You know, not all scientists can do that, that's for sure. There's some that are just more comfortable, you know, with fish otoliths and not people. So they're not as good at doing that sort of translation. But they could also be policymakers who have a more generalist background, who, you know, taken the time to have enough expertise. And I guess I'd push back a little bit in saying that, you know, it's counterproductive to talk to executives. I think what this is saying is more like that when you look at executives and their capacity to take on the science, that there's, given their incentives and what they're supposed to do, the knowledge, their time, there's challenges that is not automatic. So we have to think about, like, how do we build that? How do we build that translational capacity, both in terms of like individuals who can be boundary spanners and the structure of institutions that enable that interaction to happen more frequently and in a more effective manner, which is kind of as like, you know, the CSAMP camped model. Even though that particular forum, I just learned about this the other day. So I would like to get somebody to background me on like why it got discontinued. But like that model of how it was structured, that is an idea that just deserves further investigation and thinking about, should that sort of structure be used in other contexts?
Thanks.
Yep.
All right, we have time for probably one more question. I think all right, thanks.
Can you comment on
the communication of science and science needs across the physical space, all the way from Shasta Dam to Golden Gate Bridge, as far as, you know, executives and technical staff, and the fact that we have such a large ecosystem.
Okay. I mean, I can mostly comment on my perspective on this rather than, you know, having, this is like more intuition based on experience and a lot of data analysis than like having a hard piece of data on it. But I do feel like there's not a recognized systems level model of the Delta that kind of connects everything from the upper watershed to the to the ocean. And that's like there's models that have been developed for specific organisms, specific watersheds, specific issues that are kind of disconnected. And even at the conceptual level, that sort of systems modeling and systems understanding is lacking. And I think we need more of that. It may not be a model, like a quantitative model, but like bringing the various modelers together. I think that's part of what the collaboratory does, so that they can understand how all these different issues are interdependent and changing over time. Because right now there's a lot of silos in the science on specific issues. And without that systems understanding, we can't do kind of the one estuary, you know, concept, especially if you want to deal with the, you know, the San Joaquin River and the Sacramento River watersheds, and then the downstream uses as well. It's like, what is the Delta watershed? It's kind of, you know, it's not just the legal Delta, but a lot of the science enterprise here is focused on the legal Delta with tendrils out into the broader ecosystem.
All right, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you,
All right,
Dr.
thank
Lavelle.
you. Yeah, if you want to talk more about this stuff, reach out to me.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lavelle. That was great, and a really great tee-up for our breakout discussions, which we're going to go into right now. So scaling back out to what we're here for today, what we're talking about today, we are going to be talking about the science plan, the grand challenges, and coming up with how we as a community move toward addressing the grand challenges. So to refresh our memories, the Delta Science Plan is a 5-year planning document for the Delta science community. And this is informed by and for the Delta science community. It shares vision, principles, and approaches to better coordinate science and more effectively communicate the outcomes of science activities. And today, as we heard, we are talking about grand challenges number 3 and 4. So we just heard from Dr. Mark Rubel on number 3, and this morning from the panel on number 4. So what we're going to be doing is both online and in person, we're going to be having structured conversations on either grand challenge number 3 and number 4. So you, when you signed up, you chose which of the two grand challenges you would like to be discussing. So online, we're going to place you into breakout groups that reflect your choice. Here in the room, we can just kind of like divvy up. And we're discussing tools, strategies, and actions to address the grand challenges. And we're really going to be thinking about things that can kind of be initiated in the next 5 years, or maybe even completed, because the Delta Science Plan is a 5-year planning document. And so what do we mean by tools, strategies, and actions? So first of all, we just want to set the scene that the intent of this exercise is to be a very broad reaching and just like brainstorming activity. So don't get too caught up on whether you're doing the activity right or not. We're really hoping for quantity over perfection. And we're looking for things that you might be able to bring from your own experience. So are there connections with the work that's already going on that you're a part of? Are there synergies with, maybe you're not a part of it, but you know of a connection to something else that's ongoing? How do these grand challenges fit with other ongoing activities? So we're going to have these, in person, we have these big working sheets that we're going to be working on. Online, you're going to be in a mural board. And we have a facilitator and note taker in each group. So you won't just be given free license, you'll be given a little bit of instruction as we go along. And to help you think at the right level, remember all of the examples that we were talking about throughout the day from the 2019 Delta Science Plan. Dr. Lubell also just gave some examples as well that he was engaged on, like the Social Science Task Force, and a strategy to engage and integrate social science research in the Delta. We talked about sustainable funding and that web-based tracking system, which we have somewhat kicked off through the Delta Science Tracker. So each group will have an assigned facilitator and note taker. We're hoping to kind of bunch up in groups of no greater than 10, but hopefully at least 5 to get things started. And I think that's it for now. So we're going to break things out. And if you're online, just sit tight until you get broken up. And in person, we're going to start grouping people up. All right. So I think not all these groups were actually convened, but we're gonna go from in-person to online to in-person to online. And we're gonna go through the order on the screen. So our first group to report out, and we should get the mic. I think there's one person left in Kim's group. Sorry, Kim, I also abandoned you. And also if folks in the room can speak loudly into the microphone, because there's a little bit of an audio thing happening here and it's kind of quiet on the online. So first we're gonna go with Grand Challenge 3, Kim's group.
Yeah, is this loud enough? Am I projecting enough?
I think so.
Cool. Okay, so we are Grand Challenge 3, and kind of like big picture idea that we talked about in our group were points of contact and like what those look like. We came up with the idea of a Delta librarian. So someone who is sort of like the central pillar of Delta knowledge. You can go to this person with your Delta questions, and they can kind of help point you to different groups, different databases, to help answer your Delta questions. We talked a lot about data standardization to kind of help facilitate the easy flow of information across different groups. We talked about just movement of data between different agencies, and we talked about venues. I'm gonna wait. Okay, it went away. We talked about venues, like finding new and different venues for communication, and that's kind of like agencies with legislators, and also agencies at the community level. So those kind of different 2 ways of knowledge flow. I can end with that for now, or do you want me to talk more about it? Like specific?
I think that's great.
I think that's great. I did great. Okay, yeah.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, and then next we go to Stephen and Nick online. I don't know who you might have to report out.
Yes, I'll report out. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we were also Grand Challenge number 3. So we talked a little bit about improved data centralization. We thought that was a high impact, but potentially high effort strategy because of the long-term funding and positions that would ultimately be needed to support that. We talked about the desire to shift science culture away from the publish or perish sort of dichotomy towards something that redefines what meaningful deliverables are, and ways that we can do that as state agencies to like build in community outreach into duty statements, for example. And also the need for more academic and government partnerships to help train scientists to speak the language of decision makers and managers, for example. We talked about the need to produce simplified summaries of scientific products in order to communicate things effectively to execs, decision makers, people in the field, lay people. These simplified summaries can be used in all sorts of manners, and it's really useful to have them in the back pocket for really any sort of science product we're working on. And we talked about the ability to use emerging technologies like ChatGPT to help streamline the production of things like that. We also talked about the desire to strengthen collaborative forums to include scientists, regulators, industry, the community, and beyond. And we already know there's a ton of working groups like this already out there. So it's also really important and useful to maybe develop a documents, website, or whatever that people can look at to understand what is out there, what these groups do in plain language, who are like the audience of those groups, and also understand who is able to join and how do you go about doing that, because sometimes it's not clear who is actually welcome at those venues. We talked about some other stuff as well, but I know there's a bunch of other groups to go through, so I'll stop it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. In-room clap for you. That's really great. Yeah, we had some similar conversations actually that just didn't make it to the report out, but great to hear the similarities. The next group is going to be in person, Rachel and Hollis's group.
All right, thanks everyone. Our group, first off, great group. We had folks from the Delta Stewardship Council, UC Davis, USGS, and the sounds like Land Use and Climate Innovation, Governor's Office, Land Use and Climate Innovation. So we had a nice mix of folks, and a lot of us, we noted that the presentation from Mark was a great primer for the discussion. And our kind of actions that we put here on, at least on the prioritization matrix, came down to 6 different sort of categories. So some of these have been mentioned already from the other 2 groups, but one was about related to the idea of exec level training and that opportunity that Mark noted about, enhancing the opportunities for learning. So we have a recommendation in here specifically about that. Another one, like, and leveraging some of the kind of new creative opportunities to get those, the translation between science and some of those folks in leadership, and more field trips that was mentioned. We also had a whole category about science communication. And so some of the ideas that we had about that were about enhancing kind of the communication between scientists and communities. So kind of new ideas, I think, there. But also there was a mention about, having folks that are like kind of like influencers about communicating science, or enhancing sort of the production and fun, creative way of communicating science in the Delta. And yeah, generating new ideas for science communication. Another one, the word science czar, Delta science czar did come up, but we sort of shifted that to an example here of unified science leadership with authority. For thinking about those wild ideas, if there's a way to get that authority somewhat centralized and resourced. Another one was a big area that we focused on was building bridges between different levels of science. This is related to what Stephen was mentioning about collaborative groups that already are reaching different levels of the science community, but enhancing those and thinking about new ideas. And then the last one was about more technical side of things for addressing Grand Challenge 3. One was about kind of the modeling collaboratory that's been mentioned already, but thinking about the big push that's still needed for that. Also getting some use cases done to demonstrate the value. And another one was simply about getting a public-facing database and data harmonized so that it can be used for things like these modeling collaborations.
Awesome. Really cool. Okay, the next group to report out is Eva and Vivian online.
So, I'm Dan Ellis. I'll be reporting out for our group. Let me just pull up our things. So the first idea that we had was, this was with respect to centralization of decision-making, putting the IP into BIOPS that could potentially ensure ongoing collaboration across administrations. Another idea that was brought up was to create specific roles for scientific liaisons between managers and the scientists. So having people whose sole job was that, and or having it added as written in portions of the duty statement for specific people. And then finally, we had the idea to better connect management and scientists by developing glossaries and essentially like a text to a tech to non-tech translation, or like glossary list for to sort of facilitate easier communication.
Awesome. This like glossary concept has a lot of different uses. I think a lot of people thought of that idea. Thanks, Dan. So the last group, we did not have Elizabeth and Henry in person. So the last group is Morgan and Maggie to report out. Oh, okay, and they're in the room.
I'll try to speak loud. It's probably not going to work. I hope you can hear me. So yeah, for our group, there's a lot of overlap with what's already been said, but we had a strong focus on communication, looking at different ways to get at kind of translation as well as pathways for this communication. So again, repeating what some others have already said, but we considered public audiences, so building stronger science and public communication to improve public understanding. Also wanted to build stronger science and management communications for better science-informed decision-making, acknowledging that for both of these, it's really not just one-way communication. We really want it to be both ways or have dialogue. And in this, we also included communities and also including Indigenous knowledge into the dialogue. We didn't go into that in depth because we knew another grand challenge was kind of addressing that more. So another thing, I think this also overlaps with some things that were already said, but bridging gaps for collaborative groups, taking advantage of existing structures, existing groups, making them more impactful, intentional, possibly revisiting their charges. We also talked a bit about increasing social science capacity and funding. Another really big part of our conversation was about data, so consolidating data, so to speak, considering access, standards, formats, uses, applications. So some of the things in there were creating data hubs, standardizing data across institutions and groups, considering how it would be used, increasing capacity for synthesis to promote and process transparency, so how data are being used. And one of the things we highlighted was it's critical to identify the right research questions that truly support decision-making needs. And one thing I forgot to say about communication, but it also I think goes with the synthesis, is the level of, we kind of scored everything high impact, but the level of effort was kind of hard to get at in these general ideas. But in general, we felt like the more impactful probably was proportional to how much level of effort it was going to take. Some exceptions with that, but it's in our mural. You can see. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Morgan. I heard a lot of similarities across all those groups, which I think is really awesome and helpful, that we all are kind of like circling around these similar ideas. So we are gonna shift to grand challenge number 4. And again, some of these groups did not meet, but we're gonna start with our in-person grand challenge 4 group. Do you have someone to report out?
Hi, I'm Annika. I'm reporting out for our group. We had some really great discussion and we came up with like some specific strategies and tools, but I'll kind of just hit on like the larger themes. So we talked about questioning science as an institution or an enterprise, and ways to alter the structure of science to like integrate TK more naturally rather than it being like a separate thing. We also talked about examining the biases of science and the commodification of knowledge. And we kind of pivoted towards like, could we have a more value-oriented science system so that, you know, TK knowledge holders and quote unquote like modern scientists and Western scientists could kind of orient themselves around the same values on projects. And then we also talked about creating spaces to communicate project successes, training youth on science and cultural knowledge, building and earning trust with tribal communities and like encouraging those relationships between modern scientists and TK holders, and then respecting and recognizing tribal data sovereignty through like creating policies and guidance and kind of structure around that. So those were some of the main things. Does anyone want to add anything? Oh. Thanks. And that's it.
Thanks, Anka. Okay, so next we'll go to Margot and Edmund's group online.
Hi, everyone. I'm Margot. Our group talked a lot about how building relationships is really the key step for this work of working with tribes and other groups. And some ideas that people were bringing up was making sure that you're hiring cultural practitioners and that they're funded and valued. Some echoing of the ideas that we heard during the panel discussion earlier today of how knowledge can't be siloed from practitioners, and the idea that these relationships, they're built and that we have to be kind of worthy of them, but they also need to be actively maintained over time. So it's this active kind of ongoing process. Also conversations of how there needs to be these structured strategies to make any of these kind of goals or tools work. So one really big one that was highlighted is the communication strategy, making sure that there's kind of regular two-way communication between agencies and tribes, strategies that can involve timely involvement, and meaningful and appropriate avenues for collaboration that can be ensured to reduce kind of duplicative asks and be aware of the capacity of groups. And another really big theme was about kind of changing the way that we think or the paradigm. So really valuing traditional knowledge as equally important to any other kind of knowledge. And a few people brought up the idea of considering space as opposed to just place, and really valuing considering the kind of on the ground perspective. And then the last one was just sort of making sure that there's government to government communication. So really seeing tribes as these sovereign nations and valuing that and respecting that and creating specific positions on decision-making boards. Thank you.
Thanks, Margot. That was great. So we just had one in-person group on this, so I'm going to move to Dylan Chappell and Hannah, who are actually in the room. Oh, you combined with that group. Okay, so that is it. Thank you, everyone, for offering your thoughts and your feedback on these concepts as we move into kind of building out a lot of the science plan. It's going to be really valuable for us to have this information as we're working on developing the rest of the science plan around these grand challenges. So I really appreciate all of your input. And with that, I am actually going to hand it over to our Deputy Executive Officer for Science, Henry DeBay.
Thanks, Tricia. So I'm actually the last grand challenge of the day because I'm the barrier between you and the end of the day. Let's see. Okay, so well, before getting to that, I do want to just thank you all for being here today, for contributing to the process, to the document. Couldn't do it without you. I also want to thank our speakers. So starting with Lisamarie, Windham-Myers, kind of setting the stage this morning, Sam Luoma, and talking about ways to accelerate adaptive management in the system. Also want to thank Nina Fontana and Zack Gigone for bringing insights on interweaving and how to do that reciprocally and respectfully. So really appreciate that. Mark LaBelle, I think he had to leave, but thank you, Mark, for your presentation on ways to improve communication in the system and for priming us for these breakout sessions. Who else should I thank? California Sea Grant. I want to thank California Sea Grant for the large amount of lunches and pastries and coffee. So thank you very much. Also, of course, want to thank our Office of Public Participation for making everything run, our IT. I don't know if they're paying attention, but thank you, IT. Thank you, of course, Rachel and Tricia for making all of this happen. So yeah, let's give everybody a round of applause. And I feel like this is like an Oscar award speech. I think that's it. Anyway, thanks again. So for tomorrow, we are virtual only. So you get to kick back, sit on your couch, sip coffee, kick your shoes off, or do whatever you want. Go for a bike ride while listening in. We're gonna focus on Grand Challenge number 1 and Grand Challenge number 2. And Dr. Laurel Larson from UC Berkeley, previously Delta lead scientist, is going to be the one to provide some context on Grand Challenge number 1, and Dr. Lisa Wanger, former chair of the Independent Science Board, will talk about Grand Challenge number 2. And then we'll do the same format that we had today, some breakout discussions. And we'll be done. So virtual and half day only. Hope you can join us again tomorrow. And what else? Oh, if you signed up to be in person today, you should have gotten a link, and that link will work for virtual tomorrow. So with that, again, thanks everybody for your time, for being here, and see you tomorrow.